At 60, the spirit no longer negotiates. Carl Jung uncovers your deeper self. Jung discovered something terrifying about the human psyche that most therapists refuse to acknowledge. Around age 60, something inside you stops compromising. Not gradually, not gently. It stops dead in its tracks and refuses to negotiate with the life you've been performing. Most people experience this as a sudden, inexplicable collapse. A successful executive wakes up one morning unable to get out of bed. A devoted parent feels nothing when their grandchild is born. A lifelong achiever stares at their awards and feels only hollow disgust. The medical establishment calls it depression. Jung called it something else entirely. He called it the spirit's final demand. Between 1920 and 1935, Jung documented hundreds of cases of what he termed the 60-year threshold, a specific developmental crisis that hit his patients with surgical precision around their 6th decade. These weren't people with psychiatric histories. They were accomplished professionals, devoted caregivers, respected community leaders. And suddenly, without warning, their carefully constructed lives began to disintegrate. But here's what Jung discovered that changed everything. This wasn't pathology. It was initiation. The psyche, Jung realized, operates on a timeline most of us never acknowledge. From birth to roughly age 30, we're building a persona, the mask we show the world, the acceptable self that earns approval, achieves success, maintains relationships. This persona is necessary. It's how we survive in a world that demands conformity. From 30 to 60, we negotiate with that persona. We make compromises. We tell ourselves, just a few more years at this job I hate, then I'll pursue my real passion. After the kids are grown, then I'll focus on myself. Once I have enough money saved, then I'll live authentically. The persona allows these negotiations because it still has time. But at 60, something fundamental shifts. The unconscious, what Jung called the self with a capital S, stops accepting these promises. It stops tolerating the gap between who you are and who you've been pretending to be. It stops negotiating, and when the self stops negotiating, it doesn't send gentle reminders. It sends ultimatums. Jung observed this pattern with clinical precision. Patients would arrive in his office, often successful by every external metric, describing the same phenomenon, a sudden, inexplicable sense that their entire life was a lie. Not metaphorically, literally, as if they'd been living someone else's biography and just now realized it wasn't theirs. One of his most striking cases was a businessman named Heinrich, age 63. Heinrich had built a pharmaceutical empire from nothing. He was wealthy, respected, married 40 years, 3 successful children. By every societal measure, he'd won at life. Then one Tuesday morning, his legs stopped working, not paralysis in the neurological sense. The doctors found nothing wrong. His legs simply refused to carry him. When he tried to stand, they buckled. When he tried to walk to his office, his body revolted. Jung saw Heinrich for 6 months before the truth emerged. Heinrich's father had been a pharmacist who'd always dreamed of being a musician but never pursued it. Heinrich had dutifully taken over the family business, building it into an empire. But Heinrich himself had wanted to be an architect. For 40 years, he'd told himself, "After I secure the company's future, after I prove myself, after I establish financial security for my family." At 63, his unconscious answered, "No, we're done negotiating. If you won't stop walking this path consciously, I'll stop your legs from walking it at all." Within 3 months of beginning architectural drafting classes, something Heinrich hadn't touched since he was 19, his legs functioned normally again. This is what Jung meant by the spirit no longer negotiates. The self, your authentic core beneath all conditioning, has been compromising with your persona your entire adult life. It's allowed you to play roles, meet expectations, build structures that don't fully align with your deepest nature. It's been patient because there was time for course correction. But the 60-year threshold marks a biological and psychological reality the unconscious can no longer ignore. Time is running out, not in some vague, distant sense, in a cellular, visceral, undeniable sense. Your body knows. At 60, telomeres have shortened significantly. Cellular regeneration has slowed. The biological clock is no longer ticking, it's screaming. And the self, which exists at the intersection of psyche and soma, hears that scream and acts. Jung noticed that this phenomenon intensified specifically around 60 because of what he called the sunset of life. Before 60, we're still operating under the illusion that we have infinite time to become who we truly are. We can delay, compromise, negotiate. After 60, that illusion shatters. The self looks at the remaining years and performs a brutal calculation. If we don't act now, this person will die having never actually lived, having performed a role their entire existence, having betrayed their essential nature until their final breath. And the self finds this intolerable, so it stops negotiating and starts demanding, not through gentle whispers, through symptoms that cannot be ignored. Sudden depression that no medication touches, inexplicable rage that destroys decades-old relationships, physical ailments that appear without medical cause, a creeping sense of meaninglessness so profound that previously cherished activities become unbearable. The persona interprets these as problems to be fixed, obstacles to overcome, diseases to medicate. Jung saw them as messages from the deepest part of the psyche. Stop performing, start being, or I will dismantle this false life, piece by piece until nothing remains but the truth you've been avoiding. This is why Jung called it the spirit's final demand, because after 60, the spirit, your authentic self, is no longer asking permission. It's not suggesting gently. It's not waiting for the right circumstances. It's executing the persona you've been hiding behind. And if you fight that execution, if you cling to the false self with everything you have, the battle will destroy you. Jung documented 3 typical responses to the 60-year threshold. The denier tries to ignore the call entirely. They double down on the persona, working harder, achieving more, proving their worth through external validation. They medicate the symptoms, distract themselves with consumption or status, and insist everything is fine. These people, Jung observed, typically face the most catastrophic collapse, sudden heart attacks, strokes, or what he called possession by the unconscious, where the shadow erupts uncontrollably and they act out in ways that destroy everything they've built. The bargainer acknowledges something is wrong but tries to negotiate small compromises. I'll take up a hobby, I'll travel more, I'll reduce my work hours. They're still operating from the persona, still trying to maintain control, still believing they can manage their way through this without fundamental transformation. These people experience chronic, grinding misery, a low-grade depression and anxiety that never fully lifts, a sense of life slipping away without ever truly arriving. The transformer hears the demand and, despite terror, begins the work of genuine individuation. They acknowledge that their life as they've known it is ending. They grieve the person they were trained to be. They descend into the darkness of their own psyche to discover who they actually are beneath all conditioning. This path is harrowing, but it's the only one that leads to authentic life in the remaining years. Jung himself became the transformer, not by choice, but by necessity. His own 60-year threshold came wrapped in what he later called my confrontation with the unconscious, a prolonged psychological crisis that nearly destroyed him but ultimately gave birth to his mature psychology. But before we enter Jung's personal crucible, you need to understand why the 60-year threshold is so uniquely dangerous. because it's not just psychological, it's biological, it's spiritual, it's archetypal. At 60, three forces converge with devastating precision. Biological urgency. Your body knows it's entering the final phase. Every cell screams this truth. The unconscious, which is deeply connected to bodily wisdom, can no longer pretend otherwise. Psychological reckoning. 6 decades of unlived life, repressed desires, and denied authenticity create a pressure that becomes unbearable. The gap between who you are and who you've been performing reaches critical mass. Spiritual demand. The self, the archetype of wholeness Jung spent his life studying, will not allow you to die fragmented. It demands integration, authenticity, wholeness. And at 60, it stops asking and starts insisting. This convergence creates what Jung called the crucible of transformation. You cannot bargain your way out of it. You cannot medicate it away. You cannot retire from it or distract yourself into numbness. You can only descend into it and emerge transformed. Or you can resist it and be destroyed by it. Those are the only two options. And the terrifying truth Jung discovered is this: most people choose resistance without even knowing they're choosing it. They've spent so long identified with their persona that they genuinely believe it is them. When the self demands its death, they experience it as their own death and fight it with every survival instinct they possess. This is why the 60-year crisis looks like breakdown, disease, or madness to the uninitiated eye, but to the Jungian eye, it's initiation. The persona isn't dying at 60, it's being executed by the only force that has the authority and power to execute it, your own deepest self. The question is not whether this execution will happen. The question is whether you'll participate consciously in it or be dragged through it, unconscious and screaming. Jung spent the last decades of his life trying to teach people how to participate consciously. But first, he had to learn it himself, the hard way. The crisis at 60 isn't random psychological turbulence. It's the psyche's response to a specific mathematical problem, the equation of your unlived life. By age 60, most people have constructed what Jung called a successful imprisonment. From the outside, everything looks fine, often exemplary. Career established, family raised, retirement accounts funded, social respect achieved. But inside, there's a growing horror. Because with each passing year, the gap widens between the life you're living and the life you were meant to live. Between the person you've become and the person you actually are. Between the choices you've made and the choices your soul demanded. Jung called this gap the shadow of society. It's not your personal shadow. Those are the rejected aspects of your individual personality. This is something larger and more insidious. The collective weight of all the compromises you made to fit into the world. Every time you chose safety over authenticity. Every time you silenced your true voice to gain approval. Every time you shaped yourself to match someone else's expectations instead of honoring your own nature. Each compromise added another brick to your prison, and by 60, the prison is complete. This is why the crisis feels so catastrophic. You're not just experiencing dissatisfaction, you're experiencing the accumulated weight of decades of betrayal against your own soul. Jung documented 3 primary manifestations of this crisis: the empty achievement syndrome. These are people who succeeded at everything society told them to pursue. They climbed the ladder, accumulated the symbols, checked all the boxes. Then they reach the top and discover there's nothing there. A corporate executive looks at his corner office and feels nothing. A physician who spent 40 years healing others realizes he never wanted to be a doctor. His parents did. A mother whose identity was entirely wrapped up in raising children faces their departure and discovers she has no idea who she is without them. The defining feature of empty achievement syndrome is the profound sense of having been conned. I did everything right. Why does it feel so wrong? There's often rage at parents, at society, at themselves. And underneath the rage, there's terror. If this wasn't the life I was supposed to live, what was? And is it too late? The sudden stranger syndrome. Jung noticed this particularly in long-term marriages. Two people who've been together 30 or 40 years suddenly look at each other as complete strangers, not with the warm familiarity of deep partnership, with the disturbing recognition that they never actually knew each other. They knew the roles: wife, husband, provider, caregiver, but the actual people beneath those roles remained hidden, even from themselves. This syndrome typically manifests as one partner wanting to divorce out of nowhere. The other partner is shocked. Everything was fine. We never even fought. But that's precisely the problem. Everything was fine because both people were performing scripts, playing roles, maintaining a structure. The actual human beings never showed up. At 60, the self demands, I want to be known. Actually known, not as a role, but as a living, complex, authentic person. And if the relationship can't hold that level of intimacy, it must end. The body rebellion syndrome. This is perhaps the most frightening manifestation because it appears as pure medical pathology. Autoimmune diseases that suddenly flare, heart conditions that emerge despite good health markers, cancer diagnoses that shock everyone, chronic pain without clear physical cause, neurological symptoms that baffle doctors. Jung observed a striking pattern. These physical manifestations were not random, they were symbolic. A man who spent 40 years saying yes when he meant no develops throat cancer. The body literally closes the channel of false speech. A woman who carried the emotional burdens of her entire family develops crippling arthritis. Her body refuses to carry any more weight. A brilliant academic who never pursued his artistic calling develops early onset dementia. If he won't use his mind creatively, the unconscious begins dismantling his mental faculties. The body, Jung realized, was the unconscious made flesh. And at 60, when the psyche's demands reach critical urgency, the body stages its own revolt. But why 60 specifically? Why not 50? Why not 70? Jung identified several converging factors. The mathematics of mortality. At 60, even with modern medicine, you're looking at perhaps 20 to 30 functional years remaining, and that's optimistic. The unconscious performs a brutal calculation. If we don't transform now, there isn't time. The urgency isn't neurotic, it's realistic. The completion of social obligations. By 60, most people have fulfilled their primary social roles. Children are raised. Career is established or ending. The cultural script says, you've done your duty, you can rest now. But the self says, you've performed for everyone else. Now perform for me. This collision creates crisis, the biological shift from building to meaning. Younger bodies are focused on growth, reproduction, establishment. Older bodies shift into different modes: repair, consolidation, legacy. This biological shift triggers a parallel psychological shift. The question is no longer, what can I achieve, but what does my life mean? And for most people at 60, the honest answer is devastating. I don't know. I've been so busy achieving that I never stopped to ask what any of it meant. This is the essence of the 60-year crisis, the confrontation with meaninglessness despite accomplishment. Jung saw this in his practice with brutal consistency. The patients who arrived in their 60s weren't failures. They were successes by every conventional metric, and that's precisely what made their suffering so intense. Because failure you can rationalize. If only I'd worked harder, achieved more, been more disciplined. But success, Success strips away all those comforting rationalizations and forces you to confront a more terrifying truth. The problem isn't that you didn't achieve enough. It's that you achieved the wrong things. You climbed the wrong mountain. You lived the wrong life. And at 60, you can't help but ask, is there time to climb a different mountain? Is there time to live a different life? The panic comes from the uncertainty of that answer. Jung documented the specific psychological patterns that emerge. Compulsive distraction. Unable to face the emptiness, people fill every moment. They overschedule. They binge-watch television. They become obsessive about hobbies that require no depth. They travel constantly but experience nothing. The goal is simple. Never sit still long enough to feel the void. Sudden behavioral changes. The stable, predictable person their family has known for decades suddenly becomes unpredictable. Expensive purchases they'd never consider. Dramatic appearance changes, new social circles, affairs, reckless decisions. This isn't regression or a second adolescence. It's the shadow erupting. All the rejected impulses, denied desires, and unlived lives bursting forth in unintegrated chaos. Existential depression. This is distinct from clinical depression. Medication doesn't touch it because it's not a chemical imbalance. It's a meaning crisis. People describe it as a heaviness or a gray fog. Everything feels flat. Previously pleasurable activities bring no joy. The future feels pointless, but there's no traumatic trigger, no obvious cause. Just the slow, grinding realization that their life has been an elaborate performance, and they're exhausted from performing. Relationship dissolution. Friendships that seemed solid evaporate. Marriages crumble. Even relationships with adult children become strained. Why? Because these relationships were built around the persona, not the authentic self. As the persona begins to crack, the relationships built on it can't hold. The person undergoing the crisis often can't articulate what's wrong. They just know they can't pretend anymore, and every interaction that requires pretending becomes unbearable. Somatic symptoms. The body speaks what the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. Chronic fatigue, mysterious pains, digestive issues, sleep disturbances, weakened immune response. These aren't psychosomatic in the dismissive sense. They're psychosomatic in Jung's sense. The psyche, unconscious, making itself known through soma, body, because the conscious mind refuses to listen. The statistics validate Jung's clinical observations. Depression rates spike in the 60 to 70 demographic, particularly among men. Suicide rates in males over 65 are the highest of any age group. Divorce rates in long-term marriages have increased 109% since 1990, and the age group showing the steepest increase is 60 plus. Hospital admissions for stress-related conditions show marked increases in the early 60s, even among previously healthy individuals. But here's what the statistics can't capture: the quality of the suffering. This isn't ordinary depression that responds to serotonin reuptake inhibitors. This isn't ordinary anxiety that improves with cognitive behavioral therapy. This isn't ordinary grief that resolves with time. This is soul-level anguish. The person experiencing it often can't explain it to loved ones. You have everything. What's wrong with you? And they genuinely don't know how to answer, because it's not about lacking anything external. It's about lacking something internal: authenticity. Meaning. The felt sense that their life is actually theirs. Jung saw patients who'd lie awake at 3 a.m. with what they described as a screaming inside my chest. Not a panic attack, not heart disease. A screaming as if something inside them was desperately trying to be heard but had no voice. That screaming, Jung realized, was the self. It had been whispering for decades. This isn't your life. This isn't who you are. Turn back before it's too late. At 60, it stops whispering and starts screaming, and the scream cannot be ignored, medicated, or rationalized away. There's a particularly haunting case in Jung's notes, a woman named Margaret, 61, who'd been a dutiful wife and mother her entire adult life. By all accounts, she was happy. She never complained. She took pride in her family and home. Then one afternoon, while preparing dinner, a task she'd performed thousands of times, she simply stopped, put down the knife, walked to her bedroom, and didn't emerge for 3 days. When her worried husband finally convinced her to speak with Jung, she said something that chilled him. "I suddenly realized I've never made a single choice in my entire life. Every decision was made by asking, what would they want? What would they think? What would be proper? I don't know who I am. I don't even know if I exist." Jung noted that Margaret wasn't having a breakdown. She was having a breakthrough into the devastating truth of her own absence from her life. This is the core horror of the 60-year crisis, the realization that you've been a ghost haunting your own biography, present but not participating, alive but not living, there but not there, and time is running out to change it. The question becomes urgent. Is transformation still possible? Can a 60-year-old person who's lived an inauthentic life for 6 decades actually become themselves? Or is it too late? Jung's answer was unequivocal. Not only is transformation possible, it's mandatory, because the alternative isn't maintaining the status quo. The alternative is disintegration. The unlived life doesn't simply remain unlived. It ferments. It becomes toxic. It poisons everything it touches. At 60, you're facing a binary choice: transform or disintegrate. And the vast majority of people, Jung observed, choose disintegration without realizing they're choosing it. They think they're just holding on. They think they're being strong. They think they're protecting what they've built. But they're actually presiding over their own psycho-spiritual death. Slowly, painfully, unnecessarily, because transformation, terrifying as it is, remains possible. But only if you understand what you're actually transforming from. Only if you can see the full architecture of the prison you've been living in. And only if you're willing to acknowledge the one person who built it, yourself. Before Jung could guide others through the 60-year threshold, he had to survive his own crucible, and he almost didn't. Between 1913 and roughly 1930, spanning his late 30s through his mid-50s, intensifying dramatically around age 60, Jung experienced what he carefully called his confrontation with the unconscious. To everyone around him, it looked like a catastrophic nervous breakdown, possibly psychosis, potentially irreversible madness. To Jung himself, at the time, it felt like dissolution, like his personality was fragmenting, like he was drowning in an ocean of images, symbols, and archetypal forces that threatened to obliterate his sanity. Only later could he recognize it for what it was: initiation. The trigger was his rupture with Sigmund Freud in 1913. On the surface, it was a professional disagreement. Jung couldn't accept Freud's insistence that everything in the unconscious reduced to repressed sexuality. But psychologically, it was something far more devastating. Freud had been Jung's intellectual father, his mentor, his guide into the depths of the psyche. When that relationship shattered, Jung didn't just lose a colleague, he lost his psychological anchor. And without that anchor, the unconscious rose up to meet him. It started with dreams of catastrophic intensity, not ordinary dreams, but what Jung called big dreams, numinous experiences that carried the weight of something beyond the personal. Dreams of blood flooding through Europe. This was 1913, 1 year before World War I. Dreams of the dead speaking to him, demanding attention. Dreams where he descended into underworlds and encountered terrifying figures who seemed more real than waking reality. Then the dreams began bleeding into his waking life. Jung would be sitting in his office preparing for a patient and suddenly hear voices, not as hallucinations exactly, but as presences. Figures from his dreams would feel palpably present in the room. He'd sense the dead surrounding him, pressing in, demanding he acknowledge them. He was terrified he was going mad. This is crucial to understand. Jung, one of the greatest psychiatrists of the 20th century, believed he was losing his mind. He knew the textbook definitions of psychosis. He knew the symptoms of schizophrenia. And what he was experiencing checked many of those boxes. But there was a difference he clung to desperately. He could still observe what was happening. There was a part of him that remained functional, analytical, able to document the experience even as he was overwhelmed by it. That observing ego was his lifeline. Jung made a decision that most people in his situation wouldn't and couldn't make. Instead of fighting the unconscious material, instead of trying to suppress or medicate it, he would engage with it directly. He would go down into the abyss voluntarily. This decision led to one of the most remarkable documents in the history of psychology, the Red Book, or Liber Novus. For more than 16 years, Jung recorded his confrontation with the unconscious in words, images, and elaborate paintings. The book is massive, more than 600 pages of densely written text and vivid, often disturbing artwork. It's part mystical vision, part psychological analysis, part alchemical transformation. And it documents Jung's own journey through the 60-year threshold. Though he entered it earlier than most because his break with Freud accelerated the crisis, the technique Jung developed to navigate this terrain became one of his most important contributions to psychology. Active imagination. Active imagination is distinct from fantasy or visualization. In fantasy, the ego controls the narrative. You imagine what you want to imagine. In active imagination, you create a threshold space where the unconscious can speak on its own terms, and you engage with it as you would another person. Here's how Jung practiced it. He would enter a meditative state, not transcendent or blissful, but receptive. Then he would intentionally allow an image to arise from the unconscious, not force it, but wait for it. An image would come, a figure, a landscape, a symbol. And then, this is the crucial part, Jung would interact with it. He would ask it questions, challenge it, listen to its responses. The figures would speak back, often saying things that shocked or disturbed him, things his conscious mind would never invent. One of the most famous encounters was with a figure Jung called Philemon, an old man with the horns of a bull and the wings of a kingfisher. Philemon appeared to Jung in a dream, then became a recurring presence in his active imagination sessions. Jung described walking with Philemon in his garden, having conversations with him as real as any he'd had with a living person. Philemon taught him that thoughts come from outside the ego, that there are autonomous forces in the psyche with their own intentions and wisdom. This was revolutionary. Jung was discovering through direct experience that the psyche contains objective factors, elements that aren't personal creations but archetypal realities. But it wasn't all wise old men and teaching moments. Jung also encountered his shadow with devastating force. In one active imagination session, he found himself descending into a dark cave. At the bottom was a pool of water. When he looked into it, he saw a dead body floating, his own. Terror overwhelmed him, but he forced himself to continue to enter the water with the corpse. As he did, the corpse transformed into a shadow figure. Everything in himself he'd rejected, everything he'd tried to transcend through intellect and spiritual aspiration. This figure was crude, instinctual, violent, and it demanded recognition. Jung spent months dialoguing with this shadow aspect, slowly integrating what it represented, his own earthly embodied, sometimes dark nature that his persona as a respected psychiatrist had disowned. Another series of visions brought him face to face with archetypal feminine figures. One, he called her the soul, was alluring but dangerous. She spoke in seductive riddles and led him toward dissolution of his boundaries. Another was a dark, devouring mother figure who represented death and transformation. These weren't metaphors to Jung. In those moments, they were more real than his waking life, and engaging with them required everything he had, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually. His wife, Emma, was his anchor through all of this. She watched him disappear into his study for hours, emerging pale and shaken. She listened to him describe experiences she couldn't fully understand but never dismissed. She maintained the household, cared for their children, held the external structure while Jung navigated the internal chaos. Without her grounding presence, Jung acknowledged, he might not have survived, because there were moments when he genuinely believed he wouldn't make it back, moments when the unconscious material was so overwhelming that his sense of self fragmented. He'd lose track of whether he was Carl Jung the psychiatrist or something else entirely. An archetype, a symbol, a fragment of the collective unconscious, playing out through human form. His colleagues noticed the changes. His practice suffered. Some patients found his new intensity unsettling. His reputation in the psychiatric community became precarious. There were whispers that Jung had lost his mind, that his ideas had become unscientific, mystical, unhinged. And in a sense, they were right. Jung had lost his mind, the mind he'd constructed, the rational, psychiatric persona. What he was discovering was something older and deeper than the personal ego. He was encountering what he would later call the self, the archetype of wholeness, the organizing center of the personality that transcends ego consciousness. But encountering the self isn't a gentle, blissful merging. It's terrifying, because the self contains everything, light and dark, good and evil, creation and destruction. The ego, which likes to think it's in control, discovers it's a small vessel being flooded by an infinite ocean. Jung documented this experience in a series of writings he called his 7 Sermons to the Dead. Written in the voice of an ancient Gnostic teacher, these sermons attempt to articulate the fundamental paradoxes of existence, that God contains good and evil, that individuation requires embracing opposites, that ultimate reality is beyond moral categories. When Jung wrote them, he felt he was taking dictation from the dead, as if archetypal forces were speaking through him. The experience was so intense that he felt physically exhausted afterward, as if he'd been channeling something that used him as a medium. This is what Jung's 60-year threshold looked like from the inside. Not a problem to be solved, but an initiation to be survived. And the initiation had specific phases he would later map as universal. The descent. This is when the comfortable structures of ego consciousness dissolve. The persona cracks. The life you've built no longer holds. You descend into the unconscious, and it feels like death. Jung's descent lasted years. He'd be in the middle of ordinary tasks and suddenly feel himself pulled into inner vision. His external life continued. He saw patients, attended to family, but more and more of his energy was consumed by the inner journey, the encounter with the shadow. You meet everything you've rejected in yourself. For Jung, this included his own power drives, his darkness, his capacity for violence and irrationality. The temptation is to project these qualities onto others or try to eliminate them. The actual work is integration, acknowledging them as part of your wholeness, the confrontation with the anima animus. Jung's psychology identifies these as the contrasexual archetypes, the inner feminine in men, the inner masculine in women. They mediate between ego and unconscious. Jung's anima figures, the soul, the feminine presences, led him deeper into the unconscious, but also threatened to dissolve his boundaries. Learning to relate to them without being possessed by them was crucial. The meeting with the self. This is the organizing center beyond ego. Jung experienced it as overwhelming presence, as numinous reality, as the deepest truth of his being that transcended his personal identity. The self doesn't replace the ego, it relativizes it, showing the ego its proper place as servant, not master. The return and integration. After years of descent, Jung began the slow process of bringing the unconscious material into conscious form. The Red Book was part of this. So were the development of his mature psychological theories, the collective unconscious, archetypes, the individuation process, synchronicity. His lived experience became his theoretical framework. What emerged on the other side was not the same Carl Jung who entered the crisis. The Jung who emerged was quieter, more grounded, less identified with intellectual achievement. He built Bullingen Tower, a stone retreat where he could continue inner work away from the demands of his practice. He became less interested in academic approval and more interested in truth wherever it led. He also became strangely more playful. Friends noted he seemed lighter, more spontaneous, more comfortable with paradox and mystery. The intense, somewhat rigid young psychiatrist had been transformed into a wise old man who could hold complexity without needing to resolve it. Most importantly, Jung now understood from the inside what he was asking patients to do when he spoke of individuation. He knew the terror of the descent, the disorientation of the shadow work, the seduction and danger of archetypal forces, the necessity of grounding, the requirement of patience, the impossibility of rushing the process. His own suffering became his greatest teaching tool. When a 60-year-old patient arrived in his office, terrified they were losing their mind, Jung could say with complete authority, "I know, I've been there, and there's a way through. Not around, not over, through." And the way through required descending into precisely what terrified them most, the unconscious itself. This is why Jung's case is so crucial for understanding the 60-year threshold. It proves that even the person who theorized it wasn't exempt from it. Even the psychiatrist needed initiation. Even the expert needed to become the student. There's no bypassing this passage. You can meet it with consciousness or without. You can have tools or be blind. You can have guides or walk alone. But you cannot avoid it. Jung's genius was recognizing that his personal crisis was an archetypal pattern, not an individual pathology. He saw that what happened to him around 60 happens in various forms to everyone who lives long enough and consciously enough to face the gap between their lived and unlived life. And he spent the rest of his years giving people a map for the journey, a map written in his own blood and tears and visions, a map that begins with the acknowledgement, this is going to feel like death, because in a very real sense, it is. The death of who you thought you were, the death of who you were conditioned to be, the death of the persona you've been performing for 60 years. And from that death, if you're brave enough to die consciously, something authentic can finally be born. Jung's observations about the 60-year threshold weren't mysticism. They were phenomenology, careful description of what actually happens in human development. Now, a century later, neuroscience has caught up with what Jung saw clinically, and the science is startling. The brain at 60 undergoes reorganization as profound as adolescence, but in reverse. Instead of building capacity for social conformity and reward-seeking, it shifts toward depth, authenticity, and meaning-making. This isn't decline, it's transformation. Dr. Laura Carstensen's research at Stanford on socioemotional selectivity theory reveals something remarkable. As people age and perceive their time as limited, their motivational priorities shift dramatically. Younger people prioritize knowledge acquisition, status building, and expanding their social networks. They're future-oriented, focused on what might happen, what they might become. Older people, particularly past 60, prioritize emotional meaning, depth relationships, and present-moment authenticity. They become exquisitely sensitive to what's genuine versus what's performed. This isn't cognitive decline, it's cognitive refinement. The brain is literally rewiring itself to detect and pursue meaning over achievement, depth over breadth, authenticity over approval. Carstenson's team used fMRI scanning to track neural activation patterns. When showing younger adults images of potential social connections, their reward centers, nucleus accumbens, ventral striatum, lit up in response to high-status individuals and large networks. When showing the same images to adults over 60, something different happened. Their reward centers activated in response to emotionally meaningful connections, close family, deep friendships, intimate partnerships. High-status strangers? Minimal activation. The brain at 60 literally stops caring about impressing people it doesn't love. This neural shift explains Jung's observation that the persona becomes unbearable after 60. The brain's reward system is no longer supporting the performance. The neurochemistry that once reinforced social conformity has recalibrated. You're trying to maintain a persona that your own brain is actively rejecting. Dr. Meg Jay's research on adult development identifies what she calls the third act crisis, a specific psychological threshold that hits between 55 and 65, marked by sudden questioning of life's meaning despite external stability. Her longitudinal studies show that this crisis isn't triggered by external losses, retirement, children leaving, health problems. It's triggered by internal awareness, the mathematical recognition that more life is behind than ahead. The prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive center, reaches peak integration around 60. This region, responsible for abstract thinking, long-term planning, and self-awareness, has been developing throughout adulthood. But here's the paradox. Just as it reaches maximum sophistication, it encounters maximum urgency. The matured prefrontal cortex can now perform sophisticated future modeling, projecting timelines, calculating probabilities, running simulations of potential life paths. And around 60, it performs a calculation that younger brains can't fully grasp. Given current trajectory, given remaining years, given physical and cognitive decline curves, given unlived dreams and unmet needs, what is the probability that this life will achieve authentic meaning before death? When that probability drops below a certain threshold, the calculation triggers what looks like psychological crisis, but is actually an adaptive alarm system. Your most sophisticated neural networks are screaming, "Course correct now or live with profound regret." This is validated by research on the default mode network, the brain regions active during rest, self-reflection, and autobiographical thinking. DMN activity increases significantly after 60, but the quality of that activity changes. Younger adults' DMN activation correlates with future planning and social imagination. Older adults' DMN activation correlates with life review, meaning-making, and integrating past experiences into coherent narrative. The brain is literally shifting from "what will I do" to "what have I done?" What does it mean? Is there time to change it? But there's a darker neurological reality Jung intuited but couldn't measure. The cost of authenticity suppression becomes biologically catastrophic after 60. Dr. Robert Sapolsky's research on stress physiology shows that chronic psychological stress, the kind created by living inauthentically, devastates the aging body through multiple mechanisms. Cortisol dysregulation. In younger people, cortisol follows predictable circadian rhythms, high in morning, declining through the day. Under chronic stress, especially the stress of persona maintenance, this rhythm flattens. Cortisol remains elevated, suppressing immune function, accelerating cellular aging, increasing inflammation. Studies of adults over 60 show that those reporting living for others or feeling trapped in their life have significantly flattened cortisol curves compared to those reporting living authentically or aligned with personal values. The body knows when you're lying, and it punishes you for it. Telomere shortening. Telomeres are protective caps on chromosomes that shorten with each cell division. Their length predicts biological aging and mortality risk. Research by Elizabeth Blackburn, Nobel Prize 2009, shows that psychological stress accelerates telomere shortening, particularly the stress of social evaluation and suppressing authentic self-expression. Adults over 60 living in high-stress persona maintenance, keeping up appearances, meeting others' expectations, suppressing true feelings, show telomere lengths equivalent to people 10 to 15 years older. You're literally aging faster by pretending. Inflammation cascades. Chronic inflammation is the common pathway to age-related diseases. Cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, dementia, autoimmune disorders. What triggers chronic inflammation? Beyond diet and exercise, psychological factors are crucial. Studies published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences show that adults experiencing eudaimonic well-being, sense of meaning, purpose, authentic living, have significantly lower inflammatory markers than those experiencing hedonic well-being, pleasure, comfort, external success alone. At 60, if your life is built on hedonic achievement without eudaimonic authenticity, your inflammatory markers spike. Your body is literally inflaming itself in response to meaninglessness. Immune system senescence. The immune system ages, but psychological factors dramatically influence the pace. Research from UCLA shows that older adults reporting living authentically and aligned with deeper purpose maintain better immune function, specifically better T-cell diversity and natural killer cell activity. Conversely, those reporting living for others' approval or trapped in obligations show accelerated immune aging, making them more vulnerable to infections, cancers, and autoimmune disorders. The body stops defending you when you stop defending your authentic self. But perhaps the most striking validation of Jung's 60-year threshold comes from neuroscience research on the mortality salience effect. When people are made aware of their mortality, even subtly, their behavior changes. Younger people typically respond by seeking distraction, pleasure, or doubling down on status pursuits. They're not yet developmentally ready to face existential reality. Adults over 60 respond differently. Mortality awareness triggers a shift toward authenticity, relationship repair, creative expression, and legacy building. The same stimulus that younger people flee from, older people move toward. Why? Because the prefrontal cortex has matured enough to hold existential awareness without fragmenting. The psychological defenses that protect younger egos from death anxiety become permeable around 60. This permeability is precisely what Jung described. The spirit stops negotiating because biological reality can no longer be denied. The neuroscience reveals the mechanism. Your brain knows you're running out of time, and it's reconfiguring your motivational systems to prioritize what actually matters before it's too late. Erik Erikson's developmental psychology provides the framework. His 8th stage of psychosocial development, typically beginning around 65, is integrity versus despair. Integrity, the sense that your life has been meaningful, authentic, well-lived, that the choices you made reflected your true self, that you have few regrets because you lived honestly. Despair, the sense that your life was wasted, that you betrayed yourself, that you ran out of time to become who you actually were. that death will come before you ever truly lived. Erikson observed that this isn't a cognitive assessment, it's a visceral, emotional, whole-body reckoning. People either feel settled or shattered, peaceful or panicked, complete or catastrophically incomplete. And which outcome you experience depends entirely on whether you spent your life in alignment with your authentic self or in service to a false persona. Jung's psychological observations and Erikson's developmental theory now have neurobiological validation. The brain at 60 is designed to perform a final integrity assessment. It has the neural maturity to recognize inauthenticity. It has the mortality awareness to feel urgency. It has the motivational recalibration to demand change. When the assessment reveals profound misalignment, decades of unlived life, suppressed authenticity, persona-driven choices, the brain doesn't simply note this cognitively. It responds somatically, emotionally, behaviorally. The result looks like crisis, but it's actually an evolutionary adaptation, a last-chance alarm system designed to push you toward authentic living before time runs out. Additional research from the neuroscience of aging reveals specific vulnerabilities. Dopamine decline. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter associated with reward and motivation, declines steadily after age 60, but not all dopamine pathways decline equally. The pathways associated with status, achievement, and social approval show the steepest decline. The pathways associated with meaning, creativity, and authentic connection remain more robust and, in some cases, actually strengthen. This neurochemical shift means that activities which once felt rewarding, impressing others, accumulating status symbols, winning competitions, progressively lose their motivational power. Meanwhile, activities aligned with authentic self-expression, creating art, deep conversation, mentoring, spiritual practice, become increasingly rewarding. If your life is structured around the declining pathways, you'll experience progressive emptiness. No amount of achievement will satisfy because your brain is literally losing the capacity to reward you for it. Neuroplasticity paradox. The aging brain loses some plasticity. It's harder to form new neural connections, learn new languages, acquire complex motor skills. But research from the University of California shows that the 60-plus brain retains remarkable plasticity in specific domains: meaning-making, emotional regulation, integrative thinking, and pattern recognition across lifetime experiences. This explains why older adults often show what researchers call crystallized wisdom, the ability to see connections, recognize patterns, and generate insight that younger, faster processing brains miss. But this capacity only develops if you've been living authentically. If your 60 years have been spent performing, conforming, and suppressing, there's no genuine material to integrate into wisdom. The plasticity is there, but it has nothing of substance to work with. You end up with a sophisticated meaning-making apparatus applied to a meaningless life, which generates existential despair, circadian rhythm deterioration. Sleep architecture degrades after 60. Less deep sleep, more fragmentation, earlier waking. But psychological factors dramatically influence the severity. Research shows that older adults reporting unfinished business or living inauthentically have significantly worse sleep quality, higher nighttime cortisol, and more frequent early morning awakening compared to those reporting life integrity and authentic living. The unconscious doesn't sleep. At 60, when defenses weaken and circadian rhythms shift, it begins waking you at 3 a.m. to force confrontation with what you've been avoiding during the day. Those 3 a.m. wakings aren't insomnia. They're your psyche staging an intervention. All of this research converges on a single conclusion that validates Jung's clinical observations. The 60-year threshold isn't a social construct or a cultural artifact. It's a biological, neurological, and psychological reality hardwired into human development. The brain and body are designed to perform a final reckoning around 60 to assess whether the life being lived aligns with the authentic self and to sound catastrophic alarms if it doesn't. These alarms manifest as depression that doesn't respond to medication, anxiety without clear triggers, physical symptoms without medical cause, relationship dissolution, sudden behavioral changes, existential despair. Modern medicine labels these as pathologies to be treated. Jung recognized them as initiations to be undergone. The neuroscience proves Jung was right. Your brain at 60 is trying to save your life, not by keeping you alive longer, but by forcing you to actually live before you die. The question is whether you'll listen to it, or medicate it into silence and die having never truly lived at all. Not everyone's 60-year crisis looks the same. The specific flavor of your breakdown and the specific path to your breakthrough depends on which archetype has dominated your persona. Jung discovered that people unconsciously organize their lives around archetypal patterns. These aren't personality types in the superficial sense. They're deep psychological structures that shape how you relate to yourself, others, and the world. By 60, you've likely spent decades embodying one primary archetype in your persona, while rejecting its shadow completely. The crisis occurs when the shadow demands integration. Understanding which archetypal pattern dominates your life allows you to predict the specific form your crisis will take, and crucially, the specific work required for transformation. Here are the 5 most common archetypal patterns Jung observed in 60-year crises. Archetype 1, the caregiver in crisis. The persona. Your entire identity is built around caring for others. You're the one everyone depends on, the responsible one, the one who sacrifices your needs for the family, the organization, the community. Your sense of worth comes from being needed. For decades, this worked. People praised you. They relied on you. You felt virtuous in your service. Then you hit 60 and something shifts. The people you've been caring for don't need you anymore, or their needs have become burdensome rather than meaningful. Your adult children are independent. Your aging parents have died or are in professional care. Your career service no longer feels noble. It feels like you're being used. Suddenly, a terrifying question emerges. Who am I when I'm not needed? The shadow, your own needs. The selfish part of you that wants to be cared for. The rage at having given so much and received so little. The part that wants to say no and mean it. The desires you suppressed because they weren't noble enough. The crisis symptoms. Sudden, crushing burnout that makes even basic caregiving unbearable. Resentment toward the people you've been caring for, which generates enormous guilt. Physical collapse, chronic fatigue, autoimmune flares, mysterious illnesses, rage attacks that shock everyone, including yourself. The desperate desire to abandon all responsibilities and disappear. The typical trap, doubling down. I'm just tired. I need to try harder. I'm being selfish for wanting something for myself. You push through the burnout, which makes the eventual collapse even more catastrophic. The transformation path. Acknowledging that your caregiving has been, at least partly, a way to avoid yourself, to avoid your own needs, desires, and authentic life. The work involves grieving the people you couldn't save, including yourself, setting boundaries for the first time in your life, and learning to receive care instead of only giving it. Jung treated a woman named Helena, 62, who had devoted 40 years to her disabled sister. When her sister died, Helena was expected to finally relax, enjoy life. Instead, she became nearly catatonic with depression. In therapy, Helena revealed something shocking. She was relieved her sister was dead, and that relief filled her with such guilt she wanted to die. Jung helped her see that the guilt wasn't about her sister, it was about recognizing that She'd used her sister's needs to avoid living her own life. She'd been a caregiver not purely from love, but from fear of her own freedom. Once Helena could acknowledge this without destroying herself with guilt, she began grieving not just her sister, but the 40 years she'd spent hiding in service. At 65, she did something she'd never done. She moved to the coast, took painting classes, and allowed herself to be utterly selfishly focused on her own experience for the first time in her life. Archetype 2, the lover in crisis. The persona, your identity, is wrapped up in being desired, charming, sexually vital, emotionally connected. You know how to seduce, not just sexually, but emotionally. You make people feel seen. You're the one who brings warmth, romance, passion to every room. This worked brilliantly in youth and middle age. You had relationships, adventures, intensity. You felt alive through connection. Then you hit 60, and the mechanisms that sustained this identity begin failing. Physical attractiveness fades in ways that can't be denied. The sexual attention decreases. Younger people no longer see you as a romantic possibility. They see you as a parent figure or, worse, invisible. Marriages that were built on passion and chemistry reveal their emptiness when chemistry fades. You look at your partner and realize you never actually built intimacy. You built dependency on mutual attraction. The question that crushes you, who am I when I'm no longer desirable? The shadow. The need for genuine intimacy beyond performance. The vulnerable, unsexy parts of yourself. The aging body. The deep loneliness you've been masking with connection. The crisis symptoms. Desperate attempts to reclaim youth. Dramatic appearance changes, age-inappropriate relationships, plastic surgery, sexual dysfunction, and the panic that accompanies it. Sudden dissolution of long-term relationships. Serial affairs or compulsive flirtation as attempts to prove desirability, profound loneliness despite being surrounded by people. The typical trap. Seeking younger partners or having affairs to prove you're still got it. This temporarily relieves the terror, but ultimately deepens the crisis because it's still the persona, seeking validation rather than the authentic self-seeking connection. The transformation path, learning to distinguish between being desired and being loved, between sexual attraction and intimate knowing. The work involves grieving your youth and the identity it provided, developing genuine intimacy skills, vulnerability, truth-telling, sustained presence, and discovering an eroticism based in authenticity rather than performance. Jung documented the case of a man named Stefan, 61, successful businessman, married 30 years, who suddenly left his wife for a 28-year-old employee. Stefan came to therapy 6 months later, devastated. The affair had been thrilling initially, proof he was still vital, still attractive. But the younger woman didn't actually know him. She knew the persona, the status, the excitement. In quiet moments, Stefan felt more alone with her than he'd felt in his marriage. Jung helped Stefan see that his affair wasn't about love or even lust. It was about terror, the terror of becoming invisible, of aging into irrelevance, of losing the identity he'd built around being desired. The real work wasn't returning to his wife or pursuing other women. It was learning for the first time at 61 what actual intimacy felt like. Not the performance of connection, but the vulnerability of being fully known. Stefan eventually returned to his wife, but not to the old relationship. They built something new. Awkward, unglamorous, but real in a way their marriage had never been. Archetype 3. The hero in crisis. The persona, your identity, is achievement. You're the one who wins, who overcomes, who succeeds against odds. Your worth comes from accomplishment. Career success, athletic achievement, problem-solving, being the strongest one in the room. This worked spectacularly for decades. You climbed mountains, literal or metaphorical. You accumulated trophies, titles, wealth, respect. You were the hero of your own story. Then you hit 60 and the heroic narrative falters. You can't compete like you used to. Younger people surpass you. Your body betrays you. Injuries don't heal. Strength fades. Stamina disappears. Retirement looms, threatening to strip away the role that defined you. Worst of all, you've climbed the mountain and discovered there's nothing at the top. The question that shatters you: who am I when I'm no longer winning? The shadow, vulnerability, the soft, weak, needy parts of yourself, the failures you've never processed, the relationships you sacrificed for achievement, the emotions you never had time to feel, the crisis symptoms, existential depression despite continued success, inability to retire or step back, leading to workaholic intensification, shame spirals when you can't perform at previous levels, rage at the body's limitations, suicidal ideation framed as going out on top, the typical trap, attempting increasingly extreme achievements to prove you're still the hero, running marathons you can't physically handle, taking on impossible work challenges, anything to avoid facing the fact that achievement never filled the void. The transformation path, learning to value being overdoing, discovering that vulnerability is strength, not weakness, grieving the identity built on winning and finding meaning beyond competition. The work involves sitting with the emptiness achievement was masking and slowly building a sense of self based on presence, not performance. Jung described a case of a military officer, 64, decorated, respected, who attempted suicide after a minor failure on a training exercise. The officer couldn't articulate why such a small failure would trigger such a catastrophic response. But in therapy, the truth emerged. His entire identity was the man who doesn't fail. A single failure, something any reasonable person would overlook, destroyed the foundation of his self-concept. Jung helped him see that he'd never developed a self beyond achievement. The hero persona was all he had. And when it cracked, there was nothing underneath, just void. The transformation required the officer to intentionally experience small failures and sit with the shame without trying to compensate through achievement. To learn that he could fail and still exist, still have worth, still be loved. It took 3 years, but at 67, the officer described a strange peace. I'm not the hero of my story anymore. I'm just a man, and somehow that's enough. Archetype 4, the sage in crisis. The persona. Your identity is knowing. You're the intellectual, the expert, the one with answers. You've spent decades accumulating knowledge, developing theories, understanding systems. Your worth comes from being the smartest person in the room. This worked wonderfully. People consulted you, students learned from you. Your mind was sharp, your analysis incisive. You felt secure in your knowledge. Then you hit 60 and something peculiar happens. Your knowledge feels empty. The frameworks that explained everything suddenly seem insufficient. You've read all the books, mastered the concepts, but you don't feel wise. You feel like you've been collecting information to avoid living. Students ask you for life advice, and you realize your vast knowledge didn't teach you how to actually live. The question that destabilizes you: what's the difference between knowledge and wisdom? And why do I have so much of the former and none of the latter? The shadow, embodied wisdom, the emotional and somatic intelligence you've been transcending through intellect, the lived experience you've avoided by staying in your head, the not knowing that terrifies you. The crisis symptoms, intellectual exhaustion and cynicism, feeling like everything you've learned is useless, inability to connect with others despite extensive psychological knowledge, recognizing you've been using knowledge as defense against life, nihilism and the sense that all meaning is constructed, and therefore meaningless. The typical trap. Reading more books, pursuing more degrees, accumulating more information, trying to think your way out of a crisis that requires feeling your way through. The transformation path, moving from the head to the heart and body, learning through direct experience rather than concept, sitting with not knowing, discovering that wisdom isn't about having answers, it's about being present with questions. The work involves grieving the fantasy that knowledge equals transcendence and descending into the messy, embodied reality of human life. Jung saw a famous philosopher, 63, who had published extensively on ethics and meaning, but came to therapy because he felt completely fraudulent. The philosopher admitted he'd written books about how to live well, but had never actually applied the principles to his own life. He'd had 3 failed marriages, estranged children, no close friends. He knew everything about relationships in theory, but had no idea how to be in one. Jung helped him see that he'd been using philosophy the way others use alcohol, as an escape from the vulnerability of actual living. The transformation required the philosopher to stop reading and writing for a year, to sit with his loneliness, to reach out to his children not with lectures but with honest vulnerability, to feel his way through conflict rather than intellectualize it. At 66, he published his final book, a slim volume about how his previous work had been brilliant but useless, about how wisdom only comes from the willingness to be a fool. It was his least celebrated academically, but his most read publicly. Archetype 5, the creator in crisis. The persona. Your identity is your creative output. You're the artist, the writer, the maker. Your worth comes from producing things. Beautiful objects, compelling stories, innovative solutions. You feel alive when you're creating. This worked magnificently. You made things that mattered. You expressed yourself. You left marks on the world. Your creations validated your existence. Then you hit 60 and the well runs dry. The ideas stop coming. The work feels empty. You go through the motions but produce nothing of substance. Or worse, you keep producing, but you know it's hollow. You're imitating your earlier self rather than creating something new. The question that terrifies you: what if I never create anything meaningful again? What if the best work is behind me? The shadow, the uncreative void, the part of you that needs to receive, not give. The emptiness that's been fueling your productivity. The fear that without creative output, you're worthless. The crisis symptoms: complete creative block or sterile productivity. Despair at the wasted years creating things that now seem meaningless. Jealousy of younger creators. Compulsive productivity that yields nothing satisfying. The terror of the blank page, canvas, silence. The typical trap: forcing productivity through discipline, trying different mediums, seeking inspiration everywhere except inside yourself, producing more but meaning less. The transformation path: learning to be fallow, discovering that creativity flows from fullness, not emptiness. The work involves stopping all production, sitting with the void, filling yourself through receiving rather than giving, and waiting for genuine creative impulse rather than forcing output. Often what emerges is completely different from previous work, and that's the point. Jung treated a novelist, 61, who had published 12 successful novels but couldn't write a word of her 13th. She'd been writing since age 20, and now, for the first time, she was blocked. In therapy, she revealed that she'd been using fiction to process her life instead of actually living it. Every relationship, every experience, every emotion went into a novel. She'd never truly felt anything. She'd always been observing herself to capture material. Now, at 61, she had no life left to mine. She'd converted it all into content, and her psyche was refusing to continue the extraction. Jung helped her see that the block wasn't a problem, it was a gift. Her unconscious was forcing her to stop writing and start living, to have experiences for their own sake, not as material. She stopped writing for 3 years, traveled alone, had a love affair, volunteered with hospice patients, sat with her own mortality. At 64, she began writing again, but differently, slower, with reverence rather than productivity. Her 14th novel was published when she was 68. It sold poorly, but was the first thing she'd written that felt true. Which archetype is yours? If you're reading this around 60 and experiencing crisis, you'll recognize yourself in one of these patterns. Maybe you're the burned-out caregiver resentful of the family you've served. Maybe you're the lover terrified of becoming invisible. Maybe you're the hero devastated by your body's limitations. Maybe you're the sage recognizing your knowledge is empty. Maybe you're the creator staring at work that feels meaningless. The specific archetype determines the specific shadow work required, but all 5 paths converge on the same destination: integration. Not eliminating the archetype. You'll always have caregiving or heroic or creative impulses, but relativizing it, recognizing it as one part of you, not the totality of your identity, and integrating its shadow so you become whole rather than one-dimensional. At 60, the psyche demands this integration, not as a suggestion, as a non-negotiable requirement. The only question is whether you'll meet it consciously or be shattered by it unconsciously. Comment below, which archetype resonates most strongly with you? If the 60-year reckoning is ignored, suppressed, or medicated into silence, the consequences escalate in a predictable pattern. The spirit doesn't simply withdraw its demand, it intensifies. Jung observed that the psyche operates on a principle of compensation. Whatever is denied consciousness will manifest unconsciously, and the longer the denial continues, the more extreme the manifestation becomes. At 60, when the self begins demanding integration, ignoring that demand isn't neutral, it's catastrophic. Here are the 5 escalating risks from psychological to existential. Risk 1, psychological numbing and addictive distraction. The first response to the 60-year crisis is typically avoidance through distraction. Not in a self-aware way. Most people don't consciously think, "I'm avoiding my existential crisis." They just suddenly find themselves engaging in compulsive behaviors that numb the growing discomfort. The mechanisms: alcohol consumption spikes dramatically in the 60-plus demographic. Not social drinking, medicinal drinking. The nightly glass of wine becomes 2, then 3. What started as relaxation becomes necessary sedation. Data from the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse shows that alcohol use disorder diagnoses have increased 84% among adults over 60 in the past decade, the highest growth rate of any demographic. Why? Because alcohol reliably silences the inner voice demanding change. It numbs the existential anxiety. It temporarily bridges the gap between the life you're living and the life you know you should be living. But the psyche isn't fooled. The voice grows louder. You need more alcohol to silence it. The addiction spiral accelerates. Prescription medication abuse follows similar patterns. Benzodiazepines for anxiety, sleeping pills for the 3 a.m. wakings, pain medications for psychosomatic symptoms. The 60-plus demographic now accounts for the highest rate of prescription drug misuse outside of the opioid crisis. But alcohol and pills aren't the only addictions. Work becomes compulsive. You can't stop. Retirement is postponed indefinitely, not because you love your work, but because stopping would force you to face yourself. Shopping addiction spikes. Luxury purchases that provide temporary dopamine hits, but leave you emptier. Online consumption, news, social media, streaming services, endless scrolling to avoid the void. Sexual compulsion increases, particularly in men. Affairs, pornography, prostitution. not from desire, but from desperate attempts to feel vital, relevant, alive. Gambling shows marked increases in the 60-plus cohort. Casinos know this. They target older adults aggressively. The slot machine becomes meditation, hours lost in mindless repetition to avoid thinking, feeling, confronting. Even exercise can become addictive numbing. Obsessive fitness routines that are punishing rather than nurturing, the body becoming another thing to control when the psyche feels out of control. The escalation pattern, stage 1, increased use provides relief. A couple drinks helps me relax, I deserve it. Stage 2, tolerance develops, the same amount no longer works. You need more frequently. Stage 3, life begins organizing around the addiction. Social events, daily routines, relationships, everything accommodates the compulsion. Stage 4, consequences emerge. Health problems, relationship strain, work issues, but denial intensifies. I don't have a problem, I just need to cut back. Stage 5, crisis point, DUI, medical emergency, intervention, or more commonly, slow dissolution, nothing dramatic, just a life quietly destroyed by dependence. Why this fails? Because the addiction is treating a symptom, not the cause. The cause is existential, the unlived life, the inauthentic persona, the rejected self. No amount of alcohol, pills, shopping, or compulsion can fill that void. The psyche will not be medicated into submission. It will escalate its demands until they can no longer be ignored. Jung noted that addictive numbing typically leads directly to the next risk level. Risk 2, relationship collapse and social death. When internal distress can't be felt individually, it gets exported into relationships. At 60, relationships begin collapsing with startling suddenness, not because of new problems, but because old compromises become unbearable. Marriage dissolution. The statistics are stark. Divorce rates in marriages lasting 20-plus years have increased 109% since 1990. The demographic driving this increase? People in their 60s. These aren't marriages destroyed by affairs or abuse, though those exist. These are marriages where both partners wake up one day and realize they've been living parallel lives in the same house for decades. They never built intimacy. They built a functional partnership for raising children, managing finances, maintaining social status, but the actual people involved, strangers. At 60, when the persona cracks, an authentic self begins emerging. These marriages can't hold, because the relationship was never between authentic selves. It was between personas. One partner begins individuation work and suddenly can't tolerate the performative conversations, the emotional distance, the pretense of connection where none exists. The other partner, often still identified with their persona, experiences this as betrayal. Why are you changing? We were fine, but you weren't fine. You were numb, and one partner has stopped being willing to stay numb. Jung observed that these marriages face a binary outcome: profound transformation where both partners individuate together, or dissolution. There's no middle ground. The old structure cannot be maintained once authenticity enters the relationship. Friendship evaporation. Long-time friendships dissolve with confusing rapidity. Friends you've had for 30 years suddenly feel unbearable. The conversations that used to be comfortable now feel hollow. The activities you shared no longer interest you. Why? Because most adult friendships are structured around shared circumstances: work, children, neighborhoods, or shared personas. We're both successful, we're both parents, we're both whatever identity. When your persona cracks, these friendships lose their foundation. You find yourself unable to engage in the surface conversations that used to sustain the relationship. You want depth. They want to maintain the familiar dynamic. The distance becomes irreparable. This is socially devastating. At 60, your social network is established. Making new friends is difficult. Losing old friends without understanding why creates profound loneliness. Many people respond by withdrawing entirely, which accelerates the next stage. Family estrangement. Adult children relationships become strained or sever. Your kids, who are accustomed to you in a specific role, the provider, the caregiver, the stable one, experience your individuation as threatening. You're acting selfish. What's wrong with you? I don't even know who you are anymore. They're right. They don't know who you are because you've been performing a role their entire lives. Now you're becoming real, and it's disorienting for everyone. Some parents respond by suppressing their transformation to maintain family peace. This creates enormous resentment. Others proceed with individuation despite family disapproval, which can lead to years of estrangement. The loneliness epidemic. The convergence of marital strain, friendship dissolution, and family estrangement creates what researchers call social death, being alive but functionally isolated. Studies from the University of Chicago show that loneliness in adults over 60 has reached epidemic levels, with 43% reporting persistent feelings of social isolation. This is distinct from being alone, which can be chosen and healthy. This is loneliness, the felt sense that no one actually knows you, that you're surrounded by people but fundamentally unseen. The health consequences are catastrophic. Loneliness at 60 plus predicts 26% increased mortality risk, equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes daily, 29% increased risk of heart disease, 32% increased risk of stroke, 50% increased risk of dementia, significantly higher rates of depression and suicide. Jung recognized that this social collapse wasn't pathology, it was purification. The relationships that can't hold your authentic self must dissolve so you can build relationships that can. But most people don't understand this. They experience the dissolution as punishment, as abandonment, as evidence that something is wrong with them. They don't realize they're in the midst of an initiation. They just know they're alone. And loneliness, Jung observed, typically drives people toward the third risk level. Risk 3, somatic illness, the body's revolt. When psychological and social containment fails, the unconscious turns to the last available channel, the body. At 60, the body becomes the battlefield where the war between persona and self is fought, and the body always sides with the self. The mechanism. Jung observed that psychosomatic illness isn't the mind causing physical symptoms in some vague sense. It's the unconscious using the body as its voice when all other channels have been blocked. The body literalizes the psychological reality you won't acknowledge consciously. You've been carrying everyone's burdens. You develop crippling back pain or arthritis. Your body refuses to carry anymore. You've been choking down your truth for decades. You develop throat problems, thyroid issues, chronic cough. Your body closes the channel of false speech. You've been running from yourself. Your legs fail. Your cardiovascular system rebels. Your body forces you to stop. Modern psychoneuroimmunology validates this mechanism. Chronic psychological stress, particularly the stress of inauthenticity, dysregulates the immune system, increases inflammation, and creates vulnerability to disease. The specific manifestations, autoimmune diseases, spike dramatically in the 60-plus cohort, particularly in those reporting living for others or trapped in obligations. Rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, multiple sclerosis, type 1 diabetes onset, psoriasis. The autoimmune pattern is symbolic, the body attacking itself. When you've been attacking your authentic self for decades, the body mirrors this self-attack physically. Research from Johns Hopkins shows that adults with high scores on authenticity suppression inventories have 47% higher rates of autoimmune disorders than those reporting authentic living. Cardiovascular events show similar patterns. Heart attacks and strokes occur with alarming frequency in the 60-plus demographic, but not randomly. A Harvard study tracked 1,200 adults through their 60s. Those who retired from careers they'd found meaningful showed no increase in cardiac events. Those who retired from careers they'd endured for the money or for the family showed a 63% spike in heart attacks within the first year of retirement. Why? Because the structure that had been containing their inauthenticity suddenly disappeared. The persona collapsed, and the body, no longer able to sustain the charade, broke down. The symbolism is precise: heartbreak manifesting as literal heart failure. Cancer diagnoses cluster in specific psychological patterns. Research from UCLA's Cousins Center shows that adults reporting emotional suppression and living for appearances have significantly higher rates of certain cancers than demographically similar individuals reporting emotional authenticity. The mechanism isn't mystical, it's immunological. Emotional suppression and chronic inauthenticity dysregulate natural killer cell activity, reduce tumor surveillance, and create inflammatory environments where cancer can flourish. Jung documented numerous cases where cancer appeared shortly after a major suppression of authentic self-expression. A woman denied her artistic calling for 40 years, thyroid cancer at 62. A man suppressed his homosexuality his entire life, prostate cancer at 64. The body was forcing what consciousness refused: transformation or death. Chronic pain syndromes without clear physical pathology are epidemic in the 60-plus cohort. Fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, neuropathy, back pain, joint pain. Medical workups reveal nothing structurally wrong, but the pain is utterly real. Jung understood these as the body literalizing psychological pain, the soul pain of unlived life, unexpressed emotion, denied authenticity, all of it channeled into physical sensation because it has nowhere else to go. Pharmaceutical pain management provides temporary relief, but often worsens the underlying dynamic. The pain is trying to communicate something. Silencing it with medication just forces the unconscious to speak louder through different symptoms. Neurological deterioration shows startling correlations with psychological factors. Early onset dementia, cognitive decline, and Alzheimer's appear more frequently in individuals reporting meaningless existence versus those reporting purposeful living. A longitudinal study from Rush University tracked 900 adults for 7 years. Those with high purpose in life scores had 2.4 times lower risk of developing Alzheimer's than those with low scores, even controlling for genetics, education, and other factors. The mechanism appears to be neuroplasticity. Meaningful engagement keeps the brain building new connections. Meaningless existence accelerates neural pruning and plaque formation. Jung saw this symbolically. If you won't use your mind to discover authentic meaning, the unconscious begins dismantling your cognitive capacities. The dementia patient who can't remember their life may be unconsciously erasing a biography they couldn't bear to remember. The escalation pattern, stage 1, minor symptoms, tension headaches, sleep disturbances, digestive issues, usually dismissed as stress or aging. Stage 2, chronic conditions, conditions that require management but don't force life changes. Medications prescribed, symptoms persist. Stage 3, acute events, heart attack, stroke, cancer diagnosis, sudden severe pain, forces hospitalization and medical intervention. Stage 4, chronic severe disease, conditions that fundamentally alter life, wheelchair dependence, oxygen tanks, organ failure, severe cognitive decline. Stage 5, death. The body completes what the psyche initiated. The death of the persona becomes the death of the organism. Why medical treatment often fails? Because Western medicine treats the body as a machine with broken parts. Fix the part, cure the disease. But psychosomatic illness isn't mechanical failure, it's meaningful communication. Treating only the symptom while ignoring the message guarantees either symptom persistence or symptom migration. You fix the heart problem, digestive issues emerge. You manage the arthritis, cancer develops. The body will find a way to be heard. Jung's radical prescription: treat the psychological conflict, the somatic symptoms often resolve. He documented dozens of cases where patients' chronic pain, autoimmune symptoms, or unexplained illness improved dramatically once they began living authentically, changing careers, ending false relationships, pursuing denied callings. But most people never make this connection. They experience their illness as random misfortune, genetic bad luck, or simple aging. They never realize their body is staging a revolt on behalf of their unlived soul. And when somatic rebellion fails to catalyze change, the psyche escalates to the fourth risk level. Risk 4: existential despair and suicidality. When distraction fails, relationships collapse, and the body rebels. And still no transformation occurs. The psyche moves toward its most extreme intervention, the removal of the will to live. This isn't depression in the clinical sense, though it shares symptoms. This is existential despair, the fundamental loss of meaning that makes continued existence feel pointless. The phenomenology: people in existential despair describe a gray fog settling over everything. Nothing brings pleasure, nothing feels meaningful. The future appears as an unbearable extension of the present, but there's no dramatic triggering event. No loss, no trauma, no clear cause. Just the slow, grinding recognition. My life has been a waste. I've spent 60 years becoming someone I'm not, and now I'm too old to change it. This realization creates what Jung called soul death. The person remains biologically alive, but psychologically dead inside. The statistics: suicide rates in adults over 65 are the highest of any age demographic, with males over 75 showing the steepest rates. And these are completed suicides, the attempts that succeed, not attempts for attention or cries for help. Older adults use more lethal methods. They plan more carefully. They're more determined. When they attempt, they succeed at much higher rates than younger demographics. Why? Because they're not ambivalent. They've concluded with cold certainty that life is no longer worth living. The profile is consistent: socially isolated, physically declining, recently retired or widowed, no sense of future purpose. But often, on the surface, everything looked fine until suddenly it wasn't. The hidden suicides. But the statistics only capture explicit suicide. Jung identified what he called passive suicide, the slow death of someone who has lost the will to live but won't actively end their life. They stop taking medications, stop eating well, stop engaging in activities that sustain health. They don't consciously decide to die, they just stop trying to live. Medical professionals call this failure to thrive in elderly patients. Jung recognized it as the psyche completing what the conscious self wouldn't, the death of inauthentic existence. These passive suicides vastly outnumber active ones but never appear in statistics. They're recorded as heart failure, pneumonia, complications from falls, natural causes. But Jung asked, when a 70-year-old who's physically capable simply gives up, refuses care, stops eating, is that natural? Or is it the soul's final refusal to continue an unbearable charade? The existential vacuum. Viktor Frankl, Jung's contemporary, identified existential vacuum as the core pathology of modern life. For Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, The question of meaning became literal. Why not give up? Why continue? Those who survived the camps weren't the strongest physically. They were the ones who found meaning, a task to complete, a person to reunite with, a testimony to bear. Those who lost meaning died, even when physically capable of survival. Frankl's observation applies to the 60-year crisis. The person experiencing existential despair has lost meaning. Their life structures, career, family roles, social identity have dissolved or become unsustainable, and they haven't discovered meaning beyond those structures. The question becomes stark: why continue? If the answer is to keep up appearances, or because giving up would hurt people, or I don't know, that's not sufficient to sustain life, not deep life, not soul life. The body can continue mechanically, but the person is already gone. The particular danger for high achievers. Jung noticed that existential despair hit high achievers particularly hard. These were people who'd succeeded by every external metric. They'd climbed the mountain, reached the summit, and discovered it was empty. The despair comes not from failure, but from success's hollowness. If you fail, you can rationalize. If only I'd achieved X, I'd be fulfilled. But when you've achieved X, Y, and Z, and still feel empty, that's existential despair, because you've proven empirically that achievement doesn't equal meaning. High achievers facing this often express a specific thought: I've done everything right and it meant nothing. What's the point of continuing? The suicide notes Jung read from such individuals shared a common theme. Not that life was too hard, but that it was too meaningless. They weren't escaping pain, they were escaping pointlessness. The warning signs. Unlike typical depression, existential despair often presents as eerie calm. The person seems at peace. They give away possessions. They settle affairs. They say goodbye in ways that feel final but aren't explicitly suicidal. Family members later report, they seemed better, more settled. We thought they were improving, but they weren't improving. They were resolving. They'd made a decision, and decision brings relief. Other signs: sudden disinterest in future events previously important to them, giving away cherished possessions because I won't need them, declining invitations with vague explanations, expressing I'm tired repeatedly, not physically tired, existentially tired, increased discussion of death, not fearfully but matter-of-factly, cleaning up loose ends, wills updated, old grudges forgiven, apologies made. Why intervention often fails. Traditional suicide prevention focuses on safety planning, medication, and cognitive restructuring. Your thoughts are distorted. Life has meaning. But existential despair isn't based on distorted thinking. It's based on accurate assessment. My life as I've been living it has no authentic meaning, and I'm too old to start over. Arguing with that assessment doesn't help. Medicating it doesn't resolve it. Safety planning just delays the inevitable if the underlying meaning crisis remains unaddressed. Jung's approach was radically different. Validate the despair. You're right, the life you've been living is meaningless. It's a performance, a persona, a lie, and continuing it would be unbearable. Then introduce the possibility: but what if the life you could live, the authentic one you've been denying, has profound meaning? What if the despair isn't telling you to die, but to stop living falsely? This reframe transforms suicidality from pathology to initiation. The part of you that wants to die isn't sick, it's wise. It knows the persona must die. The error is confusing the persona's death with your own. Individuation is the death of the false self, so the true self can live. Suicide is the death of both. The test. Jung had a stark test for existential despair versus clinical depression. He'd ask, if you could live exactly the life you've always wanted, pursuing your deepest calling, expressing your authentic self, surrounded by genuine intimacy, would you still want to die? If the answer was yes, it might be clinical depression requiring medical intervention. If the answer was no, if they could imagine wanting to live an authentic life, then it wasn't depression. It was a calling to transformation that had become so desperate it masqueraded as a death wish. But ignoring even this, suppressing the suicidality, medicating the despair, forcing continued false living, leads to the fifth and final risk level. Risk 5, psychological possession, acting out the shadow. When all other interventions fail, when distraction doesn't work, relationships collapse, the body rebels, and existential despair sets in, and still no conscious transformation occurs, the unconscious takes the most extreme measure. It possesses the conscious personality and acts out directly. Jung called this possession by the unconscious. Modern psychology calls it behavioral dysregulation or personality change. But the phenomenon is the same. The person you've been for 60 years suddenly vanishes, replaced by someone unrecognizable. The phenomenology: this isn't gradual personality evolution. It's sudden, shocking transformation, usually in a negative direction. The mild-mannered accountant becomes violent, raging at family members, breaking things, terrifying everyone. The faithful spouse of 40 years suddenly has a reckless affair, abandoning their marriage with no explanation beyond, "I can't do this anymore." The responsible professional empties the retirement account on a sports car and gambling spree. The devout religious person denounces their faith and engages in behavior they previously condemned. These aren't midlife crises which happen earlier. These are catastrophic eruptions of the shadow, everything that's been repressed for 60 years exploding into consciousness all at once. The mechanism: Jung understood possession as what happens when the ego loses its relationship with the unconscious entirely. The psyche can no longer communicate through symptoms, dreams, or intuition because the conscious mind has blocked all channels. So the unconscious doesn't ask permission. It takes over. The person doesn't feel like themselves during these episodes. They often describe feeling not in control or watching myself do things I'd never do. Because they're not in control, the shadow is. This is different from shadow integration, which is conscious and gradual. This is shadow eruption, which is unconscious and catastrophic. The patterns: rage possession. Years of suppressed anger explode. The person becomes violent, verbally abusive, destructive. They may hit their partner for the first time ever, smash furniture, scream things that are true but have never been said. Family members are shocked. "I don't know who this person is." Jung would say, "You're seeing who they've always been underneath the persona. This is the rage they've been swallowing for 60 years, now vomited up all at once." Sexual possession. The shadow often carries sexual energy that's been repressed. When it erupts, the person engages in compulsive sexual behavior, affairs, visits to prostitutes, pornography addiction, inappropriate advances. This isn't about desire, it's about desperation, the body psyche trying to feel alive through the most primal means available. Often these encounters are loveless, compulsive, shame-inducing, but the person can't stop. The shadow is driving. Financial possession, sudden reckless spending, gambling away life savings, impulsive business decisions, giving money away to strangers, purchasing things that make no sense. The mechanism: money often symbolizes security, control, power, all things the persona has been maintaining. When the shadow possesses, it attacks these symbols violently, as if to say, "You thought you were secure, you thought you were in control. Watch this." Criminal possession, rare but documented. Previously law-abiding citizens commit crimes. Theft, assault, DUI, exposing themselves, stalking behavior, not because they're bad people, but because the shadow contains everything rejected, including anti-social impulses. When it possesses, those impulses get enacted. Religious political possession, sudden fanatical conversion to extreme ideologies. The previously moderate person becomes radicalized, either toward religious fundamentalism or aggressive atheism, toward political extremism of right or left. This represents the shadow's need for meaning, finding its outlet in ideology. The person hasn't found authentic meaning through individuation, so they grasp at collective meaning through identification with a cause that gives them direction and identity. The aftermath. Possession episodes often end as suddenly as they began. The person wakes up from the shadow state, looks at the wreckage they've created, and feels horror. I don't know what came over me. That wasn't me. But Jung would say, it absolutely was you. It was the you that's been denied, suppressed, and rejected for 60 years. And denial can only last so long before the denied takes control. 3 typical outcomes. Continued possession. The person remains in shadow state, personality permanently altered. They become the rage, the recklessness, the compulsion. Family members mourn the person they used to be, who's never coming back. Repression and suppression. The person is so horrified by their actions that they suppress even harder. Medications, intense control, rigid structure. They go underground, waiting for the next eruption. Conscious integration, rare but possible. The person uses the possession episode as wake-up call. They recognize it as their shadow demanding recognition and begin real individuation work. The possession becomes the initiation into transformation. The particular danger to others. Unlike previous risk levels, which primarily harm the individual, possession creates danger for others. The possessed person may become abusive, violent, or financially predatory toward family members. Jung documented cases where shadow possession led to domestic violence after decades of peaceful marriage, or financial abuse where the person drained family resources, or sexual predation toward inappropriate targets. This is why this risk level is the most extreme. It doesn't just destroy the individual, it destroys everyone connected to them. Why medical psychological intervention often fails. Psychiatry treats possession as pathology, bipolar disorder, late-onset schizophrenia, personality disorder, dementia-related behavioral changes. Medications are prescribed, hospitalizations occur, but the behavior persists or returns because the root cause, 60 years of denied authentic self, isn't being addressed. You can't medicate the shadow into submission. It will find a way to express itself. Jung's observation, possession only resolves through conscious integration of what's being enacted unconsciously. The person must recognize the shadow behavior as their own denied material and bring it into relationship with consciousness. But this requires tremendous courage, admitting that the rage is yours, the sexual impulse is yours, the destructiveness is yours, not as pathology, but as disowned aspects of your totality. Most people can't do this. It's too shameful, too destabilizing, too threatening to their self-concept. So the possession continues until external forces intervene: jail, divorce, hospitalization, death, or until the person finally desperately chooses conscious transformation. The progressive nature of the 5 risks. These aren't separate pathways. They're escalating stages of the same dynamic. You start with distraction and numbing, risk 1. When that fails to resolve the crisis, relationships collapse, risk 2. When social death doesn't force change, the body rebels, risk 3. When somatic illness isn't sufficient, existential despair emerges, risk 4. And if even the threat of suicide doesn't catalyze transformation, the shadow possesses you and acts out, risk 5. Each stage is the psyche increasing. Pressure saying, transform now or I'll take more drastic measures. The tragedy is that most people interpret each stage as a problem to be solved rather than a message to be heard. They medicate the addiction rather than asking why they need numbing. They blame the relationship problems on their partner rather than recognizing their own inauthenticity. They treat the somatic symptoms while ignoring what the body is trying to say. They suppress the despair rather than facing the meaninglessness it's pointing to. They control the shadow eruptions with medication and restraint rather than integrating what's erupting. At every stage, there's an opportunity for conscious transformation. And at every stage, most people choose continued suppression until there's nothing left to suppress, until the persona is completely destroyed, either through death, complete possession, or finally desperately through conscious individuation. Jung spent his career trying to help people choose the third option before the first two became inevitable. But choice requires understanding what you're choosing between, and most people at 60 have no idea that transformation is even possible. They think they're too old, too set in their ways. Too much damage has been done. Jung's revolutionary message: it's never too late for individuation, but it requires knowing how. And that's what we turn to next. Jung didn't just identify the 60-year crisis. He provided a map for surviving it. That map is called individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are beneath all conditioning, all persona, all false self. But individuation at 60 is distinct from earlier life work. It's more urgent, more ruthless, less forgiving of half measures. The psyche doesn't have time for gradual exploration. It demands immediate, radical transformation. Here is Jung's blueprint for individuation at the 60-year threshold, not in abstract theory, but in concrete sequential steps. Step 1. The acknowledgement, naming the crisis. Transformation begins with a single act of devastating honesty, acknowledging that your life, as you've been living it, is fundamentally inauthentic, not partially, not in small ways, fundamentally. This isn't self-deprecation or drama, it's sober recognition. I've spent 60 years performing a role, pleasing others, meeting expectations, building a life that looks good but feels hollow, and I can't do it anymore. Most people resist this acknowledgement because it invalidates everything they've invested in: their career, their relationships, their identity, their achievements. To acknowledge inauthenticity feels like admitting you've wasted your life, but Jung reframes this. You haven't wasted your life. You've learned what doesn't work. And that knowledge is the foundation for discovering what does. The acknowledgement practice. This isn't journaling platitudes or positive affirmations. It's brutal truth-telling. Set aside 2 hours of uninterrupted time. No distractions, no witnesses. Write answers to these questions without editing or softening. What life did I actually want to live? Not should have wanted or seems reasonable. What did you actually long for before you learned to silence that longing? What life did I build instead? Describe your actual life, career, relationships, daily existence, without justification or excuse. What's the gap? Where is the chasm between what you wanted and what you created? Be specific. Name the betrayals. Acknowledge the compromises. Why did I choose this? Not blaming others. What fear, need for approval, or desire for safety led you to choose security over authenticity? What's the cost? What has this inauthenticity cost you? Physically, emotionally, relationally, spiritually. What symptoms have emerged? This practice is often excruciating. People cry, rage, feel overwhelming grief. Some need to stop and come back multiple times. That's appropriate. You're acknowledging 60 years of self-betrayal. It should hurt, but the pain is purposeful. It's the beginning of grief work, which is necessary before anything new can be built. The differentiation test. Jung distinguished between genuine acknowledgement and what he called spiritual bypassing, using depth psychology language to avoid actual depth work. Genuine acknowledgement feels destabilizing. It threatens your self-concept. It creates uncertainty about who you are and what happens next. Spiritual bypassing feels comfortable. I've done my shadow work. I see my patterns. I'm working on myself. All true-sounding statements that maintain the persona rather than dissolving it. The test: are you using psychological language to understand yourself better or to avoid transforming yourself fundamentally? Genuine acknowledgement leads to the next step, confronting the shadow. Spiritual bypassing leads to continued performance, just with better vocabulary. Step 2, the shadow work, integration, not elimination. The shadow contains everything you've rejected in yourself to maintain the persona. For most people, this includes anger, selfishness, sexuality, vulnerability, weakness, irrationality, pettiness, envy, cruelty. Shadow work isn't about becoming these things. It's about acknowledging they're part of your human totality and relating to them consciously rather than projecting them onto others or acting them out unconsciously. This is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of Jungian psychology. People hear shadow work and imagine either wallowing in their worst impulses, eliminating their dark side through transcendence, confessing their sins to feel cleansed. None of these is shadow integration. What shadow integration actually means: recognizing that the parts of yourself you find most unacceptable aren't defects to be eliminated. They're disowned aspects of your wholeness, containing energy, authenticity, and power that you need. Your anger isn't a problem. It's been trying to protect your boundaries for 60 years while you smiled and said yes to everything. Your selfishness isn't a moral failing. It's your authentic needs demanding recognition after a lifetime of suppression. Your sexuality isn't shameful. It's your life force that's been channeled into acceptable productivity while the wild, erotic you was buried. Your vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the gateway to genuine intimacy you've been avoiding through competence and control. Shadow work means developing a conscious relationship with these aspects, not enacting them destructively, not suppressing them continuously, relating to them. The shadow dialogue technique. Jung's primary tool for shadow work was active imagination, specifically dialoguing with shadow figures. Here's the practice. Phase 1, identification. Week 1, identify a quality you find most repulsive in others. What triggers intense judgment, disgust, or rage in you when you see it in other people? Arrogance, neediness, manipulation, laziness, cruelty, phoniness. Whatever you most intensely judge in others is almost certainly your disowned shadow material. Write it down. My shadow quality is bias. Phase 2, personification. Week 2, give this quality a form. In active imagination, allow an image to emerge of a person or figure who embodies this quality. Don't force it. Let it come. The image might be a snarling animal, a seductive figure, a powerful warrior, a pathetic beggar, a tyrant, a clown. Draw or describe this figure. Give it detail. What does it wear? How does it move? What's its facial expression? Phase 3, dialogue. Weeks 3-8. This is where the real work happens. In a meditative state, bring this shadow figure into your inner space, not to fight it or banish it, to talk with it. Ask it questions. Why are you here? What do you want? What have you been trying to tell me? What would happen if I acknowledged you? Then, and this is crucial, shut up and listen. Don't answer from your ego. Wait for the shadow figure to respond. Its answers will often shock you. They'll say things your conscious mind would never say. Write down the dialogue verbatim. A typical exchange might look like, me, why are you always so angry? Shadow, because you never protect yourself. You let people use you, and you smile while they do it. I'm enraged on your behalf. Me. But anger is destructive. Shadow. No, your suppression of anger is destructive. I've been trying to give you backbone for 60 years, and you keep shoving me down. Meanwhile, your body is falling apart because you internalize all that rage into inflammation. Me. What do you want? Shadow. I want you to say no. I want you to stop smiling when you mean scream. I want you to use me, your anger, as the force that protects your life instead of the force that destroys your body. This dialogue continues weekly. The shadow figure teaches you, shows you what it's been protecting, reveals the gifts it holds. Phase 4. Integration. Months 3-6. Integration means bringing the shadow quality into conscious, appropriate expression. This doesn't mean acting out. If your shadow is aggression, integration isn't becoming violent. It's learning to assert yourself, set boundaries, say no without apologizing. If your shadow is neediness, integration isn't becoming dependent. It's learning to acknowledge your needs, ask for help, receive support without shame. Integration exercises. Practice small expressions of the shadow quality in safe contexts. If your shadow is selfishness, practice doing something purely for yourself without justifying it to anyone. Notice when you project the shadow onto others. When you judge someone harshly, ask, is this quality also in me? Usually, yes. Use the shadow's energy constructively. Your shadow's qualities aren't flaws, they're power sources. Your anger is power. Your selfishness is self-preservation. Your vulnerability is connection. The signs integration is working. You judge others less harshly for qualities you used to find intolerable. You have more energy. Shadow integration releases enormous trapped energy. You feel more authentic, less like you're performing, more like you're being. Physical symptoms often improve. The body stops having to hold the shadow. Relationships deepen or clarify. You're no longer projecting your shadow onto partners, friends. The common pitfall: mistaking shadow awareness for shadow integration. Many people identify their shadow, understand it intellectually, even dialogue with it, but never actually integrate it. They keep it in the shadow room of their psyche, visit it during therapy or journaling, then close the door and return to the persona. True integration means the shadow becomes part of your conscious personality, not dominant, not destructive, but present, acknowledged, utilized. You're no longer the nice person who never gets angry. You're the person who's generally kind, but also clear about boundaries and occasionally fierce when necessary. That's integration. The shadow quality hasn't been eliminated. It's been relativized and brought into relationship with your whole self. Step 3. The grief work. Mourning the false self. Once you've acknowledged inauthenticity and begun shadow integration, the next phase is unavoidable. Grief. Deep, wrenching, prolonged grief. You must mourn the person you were trained to be, the life you built around false premises, the 60 years that weren't lived authentically, the relationships based on personas rather than genuine selves, the dreams you abandoned, the callings you silenced. This isn't melodramatic wallowing, it's necessary mourning. Jung was explicit. Transformation cannot happen without genuine grief for what's being released. If you bypass this grief, if you jump to positive thinking, or everything happens for a reason, or I'm grateful for the lessons, you're performing spiritual bypassing. The grief must be felt. What? You're grieving, not just abstract concepts, concrete losses, the fantasy self, the person you thought you'd become by 60. Maybe you imagined you'd be wiser, more fulfilled, more settled. Instead, you're in crisis. That fantasy must be mourned. The invested years, 60 years of building something that now must be partially dismantled. Career achievements that feel hollow. Relationships built on false foundations. the sheer time investment that won't be recovered, the unlived life. This is the deepest grief, the artist you never became, the lover you never expressed, the rebel you suppressed, the authentic self you buried, all the years it could have been alive but wasn't. The fantasy of later. For decades you told yourself, later, after I retire, after the kids are grown, after I am secure. Now you're 60 and later has arrived, and you've almost run out of time. Physical youth, the body that could do things it can no longer do, the energy that's dissipated, the decades you can't have back, the relationships, friendships that were based on personas and will dissolve during transformation, marriages that can't hold your authentic self, family members who preferred your role to your reality. Let me tell you about Margaret. At 60, she stood in the bathroom of her Connecticut colonial, staring at a woman she no longer recognized. Vice president of marketing at a Fortune 500 company, mother of 3 successful children, wife to a respected cardiologist for 35 years. Every box checked, every expectation exceeded, and she wanted to burn it all down. Not metaphorically, actually burn it. She fantasized about it, the flames consuming the tasteful furniture, the awards on the walls, the family photos staged by a professional photographer. She imagined walking away into the night, leaving behind the woman everyone called Margaret, and finding whoever lived beneath that name. This is where the story begins, not with clarity, not with spiritual awakening, but with the terrifying impulse to destroy a life that looks perfect from the outside, because something inside her had decided it would not be ignored any longer. Margaret's story is not unique, it's archetypal. It's the pattern Jung saw repeated in dozens of his patients who reached the threshold of 60 and found themselves standing at an abyss that had been quietly opening beneath them for decades. But Margaret's story is also rare because she didn't negotiate with the abyss. She didn't medicate it into silence or distract herself into compliance. She jumped. And what happened next reveals everything Jung knew about the transformation that becomes possible, but only possible when we stop running from the spirit's non-negotiable demand. The protagonist setup. The architecture of a perfect cage. Margaret had done everything right. Not right by some arbitrary standard, but right according to the entire architecture of her upbringing, her culture, her generation. She had studied diligently, married strategically, climbed deliberately, performed flawlessly. She had suppressed her anger, managed her anxiety, maintained her figure, supported her husband, raised her children, advanced her career, and smiled through it all. The persona she built was not a lie, exactly. It was a construction, a necessary adaptation. The world rewards certain behaviors, certain presentations, certain ways of being. Margaret learned those behaviors early and executed them brilliantly. But beneath the persona, beneath the competent executive, the devoted mother, the elegant wife, there lived someone else entirely. An artist who had never painted, a woman who had never been truly seen, a soul who had spent 6 decades performing someone else's life. Margaret's unlived life had a specific shape. At 19, she had wanted to study art, not art history, art itself. Painting specifically, large canvases, bold colors, the kind of work that felt dangerous and alive. But her father, a banker, had explained calmly and logically why art was not a viable career path. Her mother had agreed. Her high school counselor had steered her toward business school. And Margaret had complied, because that's what you did, because the alternative seemed selfish, impractical, childish, so she buried the artist, locked her away, built a successful life on top of her grave. For 4 decades this arrangement held. Margaret excelled in her marketing career. She genuinely enjoyed the strategic thinking, the client relationships, the satisfaction of a campaign executed perfectly. She loved her children. She respected her husband. The artist in the basement made noise occasionally, a sudden longing while passing a gallery, a strange heaviness on Sunday mornings. But these moments were manageable, brief, easily dismissed, until they weren't. The crisis trigger came without warning, or rather it came with warnings that Margaret had been ignoring for years. It started physically. At 58, she developed insomnia, not the occasional restless night, but the grinding, exhausting inability to achieve deep sleep. She would lie beside her husband, listening to his steady breathing, her mind racing through tomorrow's presentations, next week's meetings, the 1,000 tasks that defined her days. But beneath the anxiety about work, there was something else, a deeper exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with her schedule and everything to do with the fact that she was tired of being Margaret. Then came the dreams. Dark, violent dreams. Dreams where she murdered her husband with kitchen knives. Dreams where she abandoned her children in airports. Dreams where she burned down buildings and walked away laughing. Dreams where a wild woman with paint-stained hands chased her through forests, screaming, "You buried me alive." Margaret told no one about the dreams. She researched menopausal sleep disturbances. She tried meditation apps. She asked her doctor for Ambien. The doctor gave her the prescription and suggested she might also benefit from talking to someone. "Many women your age experience a period of adjustment," he said gently. Margaret smiled and said she was fine. Just stress. Just a busy season at work. The denial was automatic, unconscious, because to admit that something was deeply wrong would mean questioning the entire structure of her life. And that structure supported everything: her marriage, her career, her identity, her sense of who she was in the world. So she took the Ambien and tried to sleep and told herself this would pass. The descent. When the center cannot hold. The collapse began on a Tuesday. Margaret was in a board meeting, presenting the quarterly marketing analysis. She had prepared meticulously, as always. The presentation was polished, the data compelling, the recommendations strategic and sound. Halfway through, she stopped talking, not because she forgot her place, not because she was interrupted. She stopped because suddenly, violently, she understood that none of it mattered. The market share percentages, the brand positioning, the competitive analysis, it was all meaningless. A game played by people in expensive suits, pretending their elaborate spreadsheets had something to do with reality. She stood there, silent, staring at the faces around the table. Her colleagues stared back, confused, concerned. "Margaret," the CEO prompted gently, "are you okay?" She wanted to scream, "None of this is real. We're all pretending. We're all dying inside these fluorescent boxes, sacrificing our souls for numbers in computer systems." Instead, she said, "I'm sorry, I need a moment." She walked out of the conference room, down the hall, past her assistant's concerned questions, into her office. She closed the door, sat at her desk, and felt the entire architecture of her life begin to crack. The panic attack lasted 20 minutes. When it passed, Margaret drove home in the middle of the day, called in sick for the first time in 15 years, and lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling. That night, she told her husband she wasn't feeling well. He felt her forehead, brought her tea, suggested she rest. His kindness made it worse, because she couldn't explain that the illness wasn't physical. It was existential. It was the sudden, overwhelming recognition that she had been living someone else's life, and now her own soul was staging a coup. Over the next 3 months, Margaret fell apart. She took medical leave from work. She stopped attending her book club, her charity board meetings, her weekly tennis games. She stopped cooking elaborate dinners. She stopped pretending to enjoy sex with her husband. She stopped most things, actually, except lying in bed and staring at walls. Her children called, worried. Her husband tried to help, suggesting therapists, psychiatrists, vacation. Her mother visited and expressed concern in that particular way that made it clear Margaret's breakdown was both embarrassing and inconvenient. Margaret went to therapy, a competent, kind therapist who diagnosed her with major depression and suggested antidepressants. Margaret took the prescription but didn't fill it because she understood in some wordless way that what was happening to her was not a malfunction. It was a metamorphosis, and you cannot medicate metamorphosis. You can only go through it. She began reading, randomly at first, books on depression, on midlife crisis, on women's psychology. Then, following some instinct she didn't fully understand, she found Jung, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, the Red Book, Modern Man in Search of a Soul. The words landed like electricity. Jung described exactly what she was experiencing, the breakdown of the persona, the eruption of the unconscious, the soul's demand for recognition. He wrote about the individuation process as though he had been watching her life from the inside. And he wrote about active imagination. Margaret began practicing that evening. She sat with a journal and invited the artist, the one she had buried at 19, to speak. At first, nothing came. Then, slowly, tentatively, words appeared on the page in handwriting that didn't quite look like her own. You locked me in a basement for 40 years. You pretended I didn't exist. You called me impractical, selfish, childish, but I never left. I've been here the whole time, screaming, while you smiled and performed and achieved and died inside. I am done being silent. I will burn down your perfect life if that's what it takes for you to see me. Margaret read the words and began to cry. Not sad tears, relieved tears, because finally, someone was telling the truth. Over the next 6 months, Margaret descended into a darkness that terrified her family and tested every assumption she had about herself. Her marriage, already strained, began to crack visibly. Her husband David was not a bad man. He was kind, successful, reliable, everything Margaret had thought she wanted at 25. But their relationship had been built on compatibility, not passion, on partnership, not deep seeing. When Margaret tried to explain what she was experiencing, David listened with the same patient concern he brought to his cardiac patients. He suggested solutions, a trip to Italy, a couples therapist, more exercise. He couldn't understand that she wasn't trying to solve a problem. She was trying to become a different person. The active imagination sessions grew more intense. Margaret would sit for hours, dialogue raging in her journal between the competent executive and the wild artist, between the dutiful daughter and the woman who wanted to burn everything down. The shadow material that emerged was shocking. Rage at her mother for crushing her artistic dreams, fury at her husband for never asking who she really was beneath the performance, contempt for her children for their assumption that she existed primarily to serve them, and underneath all of it, oh, bottomless grief for the life she hadn't lived. She began painting, at first secretly, late at night in the guest room. She bought cheap supplies from an art store, feeling ridiculous at 60, buying her first set of acrylics. She had no training, no talent, no idea what she was doing. The paintings were terrible, amateur, clumsy, chaotic, but creating them felt like breathing after decades of suffocation. Physically, Margaret's body was changing. The insomnia persisted, but something shifted in quality. She wasn't anxious anymore. She was alert, awake in a way she hadn't been since childhood. Her appetite vanished for weeks, then returned with strange cravings, spicy food, dark chocolate, red wine. She lost 15 pounds. Her period, already irregular, stopped completely. Her face changed too. Friends commented that she looked different, though they couldn't say how. The permanent tension around her eyes had softened. The practiced smile had disappeared. She looked simultaneously more tired and more alive. By the end of year 1, Margaret had lost her job. She resigned before they could fire her, moved out of the master bedroom, and told David she needed space to figure out who she was. Her children were alarmed. Her mother was horrified. Her friends were concerned and gossipy. Margaret didn't care, or rather, she cared, but she cared more about not betraying herself again. This was the depths, the true underworld, the place where everything familiar dissolves and you stand naked in the dark, uncertain whether you're dying or being born. The trials, walking through fire. Years 2 through 4 were not a straight line toward healing. They were a spiral. Moments of clarity followed by collapse. Breakthroughs followed by backsliding. Progress followed by profound doubt. Margaret moved into a small apartment. 1 bedroom, minimal furniture, large windows with good light. She took a part-time consulting job. Enough money to survive, not enough to consume her. She painted every day. The painting itself became her primary active imagination practice. She would stand in front of blank canvases and let her hands move without planning, without judging. Images emerged. Wild women, burning houses, birds escaping cages, forests thick with darkness and light. Her therapist, initially resistant to Jung's approach, became an ally. Together they worked through the shadow material systematically. Margaret confronted her rage at her mother, not through confrontation but through understanding. She saw how her mother had also lived an unlived life, trapped by her generation's expectations, passing down the imprisonment she herself had never escaped. She confronted her resentment toward David. In couples therapy, she tried to explain, "I'm not angry at you for who you are. I'm angry at myself for pretending to be someone who wanted this kind of marriage. I built a cage and then resented you for living in it with me." David, to his credit, tried to understand, but understanding didn't bridge the fundamental gap. He had married the persona. He loved the competent, reliable Margaret who managed everything smoothly. This new Margaret, raw, searching, volatile, was a stranger to him. They separated formally in year 2. The divorce was amicable on the surface, excruciating underneath. Margaret grieved not just the marriage, but the death of the story she had told herself about who she was. The grief was physical. There were days she couldn't get out of bed, not from depression, but from the sheer somatic weight of mourning a life that had never been fully alive. Her dreams intensified. The violent dreams subsided, replaced by dreams of descent, climbing down wells, descending staircases, diving into dark water. Jung's work had taught her to read these dreams as necessary movements. Down was the only way through. Then came the synchronicities. She would think about needing a particular insight, and a book would appear. Left behind at a coffee shop, recommended by a stranger, gifted by her therapist. She would struggle with a painting, and the solution would come in a dream. She would feel overwhelmed with isolation, and an old friend would call, someone who had always seen past her persona. Jung had written about synchronicity as evidence that the psyche is not isolated, but connected to something larger, the collective unconscious, the anima mundi, the creative force that orchestrates reality itself. Margaret began to trust these moments. They felt like breadcrumbs left by a larger self, guiding her through the labyrinth. By year 3, small creative expressions began to emerge publicly. Margaret joined an art collective for amateur painters. The first session was humiliating. She was surrounded by people with decades of practice, and her work was obviously amateur. But she stayed. Week after week, she showed up and painted and received feedback, and slowly, incrementally, got better. More importantly, she found her voice. Her paintings had a raw honesty that the more technically skilled artists often lacked. They depicted psychological truths, the terror of transformation, the beauty in breakdown, the violence of becoming real. A gallery owner visiting the collective's annual show paused in front of Margaret's largest canvas. It showed a woman climbing out of her own chest, emerging bloody and radiant while the empty body smiled below. "This," the gallery owner said, "is what people need to see." He offered her a spot in a group show. Margaret's first instinct was to refuse. Who was she to show in a real gallery? She wasn't a real artist. She'd only been painting for 3 years. Then she recognized the voice making those arguments. It was the old persona trying to protect her by keeping her small. She accepted the show. New relationships began forming, not romantic relationships. Margaret was still too raw for that, still too focused on the internal work, but authentic friendships. She met other women who had undergone similar transformations. A former lawyer now teaching yoga, a retired executive writing poetry, a grandmother who had left her wealthy husband to live in a cabin and make pottery. These women became a coven, though they never called it that. They met monthly, sometimes more often. They shared their dreams, their struggles, their terrors. They held space for each other's shadows. They celebrated small victories, a difficult conversation navigated honestly, a creative project completed, a moment of genuine self-compassion. Testing authenticity in the world proved harder than Margaret expected. Her children, now adults with their own families, struggled to accept this new version of their mother. Her daughter was angry. "You left Dad for what? To paint? That's selfish, Mom. That's a midlife crisis, not a spiritual awakening." Margaret understood her daughter's anger. It was easier to label this transformation as selfish than to consider that maybe, just maybe, their perfect family had been built on their mother's slow self-betrayal. Her son was more sympathetic but distant. He didn't know what to do with a mother who talked about shadow work and individuation and the soul's demands. The relationship felt strained, careful. Only her youngest, her son who had always been different, seemed to understand. "You're more real now, Mom," he said simply. "It's weird, but it's better." There were setbacks, moments when Margaret questioned everything, month-long periods where she couldn't paint, couldn't write, couldn't access the creative flow that had sustained her. Times when the old voice returned, "You've destroyed your life for nothing. You're alone, poor, painting bad art, pretending this is spiritual when really you're just depressed and delusional." During these periods, Margaret learned the necessity of discipline. Spiritual transformation, she discovered, isn't sustained by inspiration. It's sustained by commitment. She painted even when she didn't want to. She meditated even when it felt pointless. She wrote in her journal even when the words felt dead. And slowly, the creative flow would return. The connection to something deeper would reestablish itself. She would remember why she had jumped into the abyss in the first place. The emergence, the birth of a true self. By year 4, something fundamental had shifted. Margaret woke one morning and realized the terror had lifted. Not completely. She still had moments of panic, still wrestled with doubt and shadow. But the baseline had changed. She no longer felt like she was falling. She felt like she was standing on new ground, ground that belonged to her. Her art had evolved. The raw, chaotic early paintings had given way to more refined work that still retained their psychological honesty. She had developed a distinctive style, figurative work with surreal elements, women in various states of transformation, imagery that spoke to the individuation process without being didactic. The group show had led to a solo exhibition, small gallery, modest sales, but genuine recognition. Critics used words like unflinching, psychologically acute, late bloomer with something urgent to say. Margaret didn't quit her consulting work. She needed the income, and she had learned the hard way that Spiritual transformation doesn't exempt you from practical reality, but she reduced her hours further. Her work became something she did to support her art rather than the other way around. More importantly, her relationship to work had changed. When she consulted, she brought her full self, the psychological insight, the creative thinking, the willingness to name uncomfortable truths. Some clients found this off-putting, others found it invaluable. She worked only with the latter. Her body felt different. The chronic tension that had lived in her shoulders for decades had released. She moved more freely, laughed more easily, cried more openly. Sex, when she eventually opened to it again, was a revelation, not because she had found some perfect partner, but because she was finally present in her own body, finally willing to desire without shame or performance. She dated briefly in year 5, a few men from online apps, a brief affair with a fellow artist. None of them became serious relationships. At first, Margaret worried this meant something was wrong with her. Then she realized she wasn't looking for someone to complete her. She was complete already. If a partner appeared who could walk alongside this new, authentic Margaret, someone who wanted depth, truth, consciousness, that would be welcome. But she didn't need it. This realization was itself a transformation. For her entire life, Margaret had structured her identity around relationships: daughter, wife, mother. Now she was discovering what it meant to exist as herself. Period. The relationship with her children slowly improved. Not back to what it had been. That relationship had been built on a false foundation, but toward something more honest. Her daughter remained skeptical, but they could have real conversations now, difficult conversations about family patterns and inherited expectations. Her younger son became close. They would meet for long walks and talk about creativity, consciousness, the challenge of living authentically in a world that rewards performance. By year 6, Margaret had fully stepped into her role as an artist, not a successful artist by conventional standards. She wasn't wealthy, wasn't famous, wasn't in major galleries, but a real artist. Someone who created from necessity, from psychological truth, from the depths of the individuation process. Her work began to attract a specific audience, other people undergoing transformation, particularly women in their 50s and 60s who recognized their own journeys in Margaret's paintings. She received emails, letters, messages from strangers who said, "You painted my life. You painted what I can't yet say." This became her purpose. Not fame, not recognition, not commercial success, but this: to make visible the invisible process of becoming real, to witness for others what others had witnessed for her. She started teaching workshops, small groups, intensive weekends, focused on active imagination and creative expression as a path to individuation. She was nervous at first. Who was she to teach? She wasn't a trained Jungian analyst, wasn't a licensed therapist. But the workshops filled. People came because Margaret wasn't teaching theory. She was teaching from lived experience. She was standing as proof that transformation is possible, that the soul's demands can be met, that you can jump into the abyss at 60 and climb out the other side, not fixed, not perfected, but real. The ongoing life, the work that never ends. Year 6 brought peace, but not permanence. Margaret learned quickly that individuation is not a destination. It's an orientation, a commitment to ongoing consciousness, ongoing honesty, ongoing relationship with the unconscious. The shadow work continued. New layers emerged, more subtle than the first explosive eruptions, but no less important. Spiritual inflation became a real danger, the temptation to see herself as enlightened, healed, beyond the struggles of ordinary people. When she caught herself thinking this way, she returned to active imagination, journaling, dialogue with the parts of herself that remained unintegrated. Her practice became non-negotiable. every morning before anything else. Meditation, active imagination, creative expression, not as discipline but as necessity. She had learned the hard way that when she skipped these practices, she began to drift back toward unconsciousness, back toward persona, back toward the slow death of performance. Aging brought new challenges. Her body, which had felt so alive during the initial transformation, now faced the reality of decline. Arthritis in her hands made painting painful some days. Her energy levels fluctuated. She had to reckon with mortality in ways she hadn't at 60. But she faced these challenges from a different ground. She wasn't terrified of aging because she was no longer trying to preserve an identity based on youth, beauty, achievement. She was watching her body age while her psyche deepened, and she trusted the process. She began mentoring younger women, women in their 40s and 50s who were feeling the first stirrings of their own crises. Margaret didn't offer solutions or prescriptions. She offered witness. She would listen to their stories and say gently, "What you're experiencing isn't pathology. It's the soul calling you home. The question is whether you'll answer." Some did, some didn't. Margaret learned to accept that not everyone would choose the path of individuation. The call comes to everyone, but the fear is real, and sometimes the fear wins. She didn't judge this. She had compassion for how terrifying it is to burn down your life in service of something you can barely name. Her relationship with David evolved in unexpected ways. They remained divorced, but after several years of distance, they began meeting occasionally for coffee. There was a tenderness between them now, a recognition that they had both been trapped by expectations neither of them had chosen. "I'm sorry," Margaret said once, "for pretending to be someone I wasn't, for making you love a ghost." David was quiet for a long time. Then, "I'm sorry for never asking who you really were. I thought loving the surface was enough." They weren't friends, exactly, but they had become something deeper than friends. Two people who had walked through fire and come out the other side with hard-won wisdom and mutual respect. Margaret's art continued to evolve. By year 8, her paintings had become less dark, less violent, though they retained their psychological depth. She painted images of integration now, women whole and fragmented simultaneously, landscapes that were both beautiful and terrifying, faces that held light and shadow in the same expression. A major gallery in New York approached her. They wanted to do a retrospective of her work, framing it as a study in late-life transformation. Margaret considered refusing. The art world's tendency to commercialize consciousness made her wary. But her therapist, still a trusted guide, challenged her. "Is this resistance wisdom or fear? Are you protecting your integrity or hiding from visibility?" Margaret sat with the question and realized visibility itself was part of the work, not for ego but for service. Her story, her art, her willingness to be seen in the fullness of her transformation, this could be medicine for others. She accepted the show, the subtle ongoing refinement. By year 10, Margaret had entered what Jung called the third stage of life, the stage where the individuated person becomes a vessel for wisdom, a bridge between the personal and the transpersonal. She continued to paint, but the urgency had softened. Creation had become devotion rather than necessity. She painted when images came, when the unconscious had something to say. The rest of the time she lived simply, walks in nature, time with friends, sitting in silence, reading. She had become, in Jung's words, a person who could hold the tension of opposites without being torn apart by them. She could be alone without being lonely. She could be connected without losing herself. She could embrace both the tragedy and the beauty of existence without needing to resolve the contradiction. This capacity made her invaluable to others. People sought her out, not for advice, but for presence. She had the quality all individuated people develop. the ability to sit with someone in their darkness without trying to fix them, to witness their struggle without judgment, to hold space for transformation without forcing it. She remained vigilant. The shadow doesn't disappear when you integrate it. It just stops controlling you unconsciously. Margaret could feel it still, the part of her that wanted to control, the part that craved recognition, the part that sometimes judged others for not doing their inner work. But she knew these parts now. She could dialogue with them, understand their fears, integrate their energy without being possessed by them. New challenges arose. Her mother died in year 11. The grief was complex, mourning not just the woman who had died, but the relationship they had never fully healed. Margaret sat with this grief without trying to resolve it. She let herself feel the anger and the love simultaneously, the resentment and the compassion, the loss and the relief. At the funeral, her siblings, who had watched Margaret's transformation with confusion and disapproval, seemed different, quieter, less certain. Her brother pulled her aside. "I envy you," he said. "You had the courage to blow up your life. I'm 65 and still pretending." Margaret didn't say, "It's not too late," though it was true. She just held his hand and let him feel whatever he was feeling. The wisdomkeeper, legacy and service. By her 70th birthday, Margaret had become what every individuated elder becomes, a wisdom keeper. Not because she had all the answers, but because she had walked through fire and emerged with the scars to prove it. Because she had faced the abyss and learned its language. Because she had died to one life and been born into another, and she knew, in her bones, in her paintings, in every conversation she had, that transformation is possible. She published a book in year 12. Not a self-help book, not a memoir exactly, but a series of essays and paintings exploring the individuation process through the lens of her own experience. It found a small but devoted audience. People in crisis, people awakening, people who needed to know that the terror they felt was the beginning of something sacred. The letters that came in response moved her to tears. People wrote, "You gave me permission to jump. You showed me the abyss has a bottom. You proved that becoming real is worth the cost." This was the legacy, not the paintings themselves, though they would outlive her, not the book, though it would guide others, but the living proof that a human being can choose consciousness over comfort, authenticity over acceptance, soul over persona, and not just survive, but thrive. Margaret continued teaching her workshops, now traveling to other cities, other countries. She worked with people of all ages, but she specialized in what she called the second half crisis, the wake-up call that comes at midlife or beyond. When the soul refuses to be silent any longer, she taught them what she had learned. That breakdown is breakthrough. That the shadow is not your enemy but your guide. That the parts of yourself you most despise often hold the keys to your wholeness. That you cannot individuate without community, but community cannot do the work for you. That creativity is not about making beautiful things, but about making the invisible visible. That the unlived life doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It festers, it erupts, it destroys you from within. That it's never too late to jump. That the spirit's demands are non-negotiable, but the spirit also provides everything you need to meet those demands. The final chapter, Facing Death from Wholeness. At 75, Margaret was diagnosed with cancer. Stage 3, treatable but serious. The prognosis was uncertain. She might have 5 years. She might have 15. Her first response was fear, the animal terror of death that no amount of spiritual work completely erases. But underneath the fear there was something else. Acceptance. Not resignation, but a deep, embodied understanding that she had lived, really lived. She had answered the call. She had become real. This changed everything. She went through treatment, surgery, chemotherapy, the brutal physical assault that modern medicine calls healing. And throughout it, she painted. Weaker paintings, smaller canvases, but paintings nonetheless. Images of disintegration and dissolution, of the body failing while the psyche expands, of death as transformation rather than ending. Her children rallied around her. Even her daughter, who had resisted Margaret's transformation for years, softened. "Mom," she said one night, sitting beside the hospital bed, "I get it now. I didn't understand before, but I get it. You weren't running away from us. You were running toward yourself." Margaret squeezed her hand. "It's both," she said. "That's the terrible truth. To become yourself, you sometimes have to leave behind the people who love the old you. But if they really love you, they eventually learn to love the new you too." The cancer went into remission after treatment. Whether temporarily or permanently, no one knew. Margaret returned to her small apartment, her studio, her daily practices. She moved more slowly now, tired more easily, but she was fully present, fully alive in whatever time remained. She wrote a final essay, published in a small literary journal, about facing death from the ground of individuation. She wrote, "When you have lived authentically, death is not the enemy. Death is the final transformation, the ultimate letting go of persona, the return to the source from which consciousness emerged. I do not welcome death. I love this life, this body, this world. But I do not fear death the way I once feared becoming myself. Because I understand now that to be born and to die are the same process, the release of one form so another can emerge. I have practiced this release for 15 years now, again and again, dying to who I was so I could become who I am. Death, when it comes, will simply be the final repetition of the lesson I've been learning all along. Let go, let go, let go." The success that transcends success. Margaret's story does not have a fairy tale ending. She is not wealthy. She is not famous. She is not conventionally happy in the way that women's magazines and pharmaceutical commercials define happiness. But she is real, deeply, terrifyingly, beautifully real. She knows herself, the light and the shadow, the beauty and the ugliness, the wisdom and the wound. She has integrated enough of her psyche that she is no longer controlled by unconscious forces. She can choose her responses rather than react from conditioning. She has created a body of work that matters, not to the masses, but to the people who need it. Her paintings hang in living rooms and therapists' offices, reminding people that transformation is possible, that the soul's demands can be met, that it's never too late to become real. She has relationships of genuine depth. Not many. Individuation tends to thin your circle considerably, but the relationships she has are based on truth rather than performance, seeing rather than projection, love rather than need. She has purpose. Every day she wakes knowing why she's here, to be conscious, to create, to witness others in their becoming, to serve the larger movement of consciousness, awakening to itself. And she has peace, not the peace of having solved all problems or answered all questions, but the peace of being in right relationship with her own soul, of having honored the spirit's non-negotiable demands, of having jumped when the abyss appeared beneath her and discovered that she could fly. This is what success looks like on the individuation path. Not triumph over suffering, but transformation through suffering. Not the elimination of shadow, but the integration of shadow. Not the achievement of permanent happiness, but the discovery of authentic being. Margaret stands now as proof of what Jung knew, and what our culture desperately needs to remember, that the 60-year crisis is not a problem to be solved, but an initiation to be undergone. That the spirit's demands, though terrifying, are in service of our becoming. That the unlived life, when finally lived, offers gifts beyond anything the persona could imagine. And that it's never, ever too late to answer the call. Margaret's story is not just Margaret's story, it's a fractal, a pattern that repeats at every scale: individual, family, culture, civilization. When one person undergoes genuine individuation, the effects ripple outward in ways we can measure and ways we can't. When millions refuse the call, the consequences manifest as collective crisis. We are living in that collective crisis right now. Jung understood something that most of psychology still fails to grasp. The individual psyche is not separate from the collective psyche. They interpenetrate. They influence each other constantly. And when a critical mass of individuals lives unconsciously, possessed by unintegrated shadow, the collective itself becomes possessed. The crises we face, environmental collapse, political extremism, epidemic mental illness, cultural disintegration, are not separate problems, requiring separate solutions. They are symptoms of the same root disease: a civilization in denial of its own shadow, a culture that has suppressed the soul's demands for so long that the soul is now destroying everything we've built in order to get our attention. This is not metaphor. This is not spiritual bypassing. This is psychology and ecology and politics and metaphysics converging on a single urgent truth. We are running out of time to wake up. And the waking up must begin where all genuine transformation begins, with individuals willing to face their own darkness, to answer their own calls, to undergo their own individuation processes. Jung wrote, "The world hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man." He meant it literally, the collective unconscious, the ocean beneath all islands. To understand why Margaret's transformation matters beyond Margaret, you need to understand Jung's most radical discovery, the collective unconscious. Most people think of consciousness as personal, private, locked inside individual skulls. My thoughts are mine, yours are yours, and never shall the two meet except through the crude medium of language and behavior. Jung discovered this is false. Beneath the personal unconscious, beneath your private memories, your individual traumas, your unique complexes, lies a deeper layer, the collective unconscious, a psychic substrate shared by all humanity, containing the archetypal patterns, the primordial images, the universal structures that shape human experience across all cultures and throughout all time. The collective unconscious is not a theory. It's an empirical observation. Jung noticed that his patients, regardless of cultural background or education, produced dreams and visions containing symbols they had never consciously encountered. A Swiss housewife who had never studied mythology dreamed of ancient Greek gods. A German factory worker with no knowledge of alchemy drew images identical to medieval alchemical texts. How? Because the psyche is not isolated, it's connected at depths we barely understand to a shared field of meaning, a collective layer where all human souls overlap and interpenetrate. This means something extraordinary and terrifying. What happens in one psyche affects all psyches. When Margaret integrated her shadow, she didn't just heal herself, she shifted the field. She made it fractionally easier for every other woman to face her own unlived life. She weakened the collective possession that keeps millions of people trapped in personas. Conversely, when someone refuses the call, when they suppress the shadow, deny the soul's demands, live unconsciously, they strengthen the collective possession. They add their energy to the mass of unintegrated darkness that accumulates in the collective psyche like psychic pollution. And eventually, that accumulated shadow erupts, not just personally, but collectively. The shadow projected, how personal unconsciousness becomes. Collective crisis. Jung spent the 1930s watching in horror as Germany descended into Nazism. He understood what most observers missed. The Nazis weren't an anomaly, they were a symptom. They were the eruption of the collective shadow. Everything the German people had repressed, denied, disowned for generations, projected onto external enemies and acted out with systematic brutality. The German people had been told to be orderly, disciplined, controlled. They had suppressed their wildness, their irrationality, their darkness. They had built a civilization on repression, and the repressed material, unable to find conscious integration, exploded outward. It possessed the entire nation. Ordinary people, teachers, doctors, bureaucrats, committed atrocities because they were unconscious, identified with collective forces they hadn't individuated from. Jung wrote, "The shadow is that hidden, repressed, for the most part inferior and guilt-laden personality whose ultimate ramifications reach back into the realm of our animal ancestors. If it has been believed hitherto that the human shadow was the source of all evil, it can now be ascertained on closer investigation that the unconscious man, that is his shadow, does not consist only of morally reprehensible tendencies, but also displays a number of good qualities such as normal instincts, appropriate reactions, realistic insights, creative impulses, etc. The shadow is not evil, it's unconscious, and unconsciousness, when collective, produces evil on scales individuals cannot imagine. This is still happening, right now, everywhere. Look at American politics, the extreme polarization, the tribal rage, the complete inability to see the other side as human. This is collective shadow projection at massive scale. The right projects onto the left everything it has disowned about itself. The chaos, the emotionality, the feminine, the irrational. The left projects onto the right everything it has disowned. The shadow of its own power drives, its own tribalism, its own capacity for authoritarianism. Neither side can see that what they hate in the other is what they've repressed in themselves. And because millions of individuals refuse to do their own shadow work, because Margaret's crisis is repeated in millions of people who choose medication over metamorphosis, distraction over dissent, the collective shadow grows stronger. Environmental destruction, the shadow acting out. The environmental crisis is not primarily a technological problem, it's a psychological problem. Specifically, it's the shadow of industrial civilization acting out on a planetary scale. Modern culture is built on a massive repression. We have disowned our connection to nature, to the body, to the earth, to the cyclical processes of death and regeneration. We have identified exclusively with consciousness, reason, progress, transcendence. We have built a civilization that treats the earth as dead matter, to be exploited rather than living being to be honored. This split, spirit over matter, mind over body, human over nature, is not just a philosophical error, it's a psychological wound. And like all psychological wounds that aren't consciously addressed, it festers and erupts. The eruption looks like climate change, mass extinction, deforestation, ocean acidification, topsoil depletion, microplastics in every living system on Earth. We are destroying the planet not because we're evil, but because we're unconscious. We're acting out the shadow of our own split from nature. We're projecting our disowned darkness onto the earth itself and then attacking it, dominating it, consuming it. And no amount of green technology will solve this until we address the psychological root. Our collective refusal to integrate the shadow, to honor the body, to recognize our embeddedness in the living world. Jung knew this. He wrote extensively about how the modern obsession with progress and rationality had cut us off from the instinctual, cyclical wisdom of the unconscious. He warned that this split would lead to catastrophe, not as punishment from the gods, but as natural consequence. When you repress half of reality, eventually the repressed half destroys you. The only solution is the same solution that saved Margaret: dissent, integration, conscious relationship with the parts of ourselves we've disowned. When individuals do this work, when they reclaim their connection to body, to earth, to the cyclical processes of death and rebirth, they shift the collective field. They weaken the possession that drives environmental destruction. They become living bridges between the rational mind and the instinctual wisdom we desperately need. Political extremism, the unlived life. Weaponized, every authoritarian movement in history has been fueled by unlived lives. People who have suppressed their own shadows, denied their own authenticity, betrayed their own souls. These people become dangerous because the unlived energy doesn't disappear. It gets redirected, projected, weaponized. Jung saw this clearly in the rise of fascism. The men, mostly men, who joined extremist movements were not monsters. They were ordinary people who had lived inauthentically, suppressed their individuality, betrayed their deeper natures for the sake of social acceptance. And that betrayal created a rage that needed a target. The target became Jews, immigrants, intellectuals, artists, anyone who represented the unlived aspects of their own psyches. The same pattern repeats today. Look at who joins extremist movements, left or right, religious or secular. They are disproportionately people who have failed to individuate, people trapped in rigid personas, people who have never asked who they really are beneath the conditioning. These people are vulnerable to collective possession. They merge with ideologies, with leaders, with movements, because they have no solid inner ground. They have never done the work of becoming individuals. And in their unconsciousness, they become agents of destruction. This is why Margaret's transformation matters. Every person who individuates is one less person available for possession by collective forces. Every person who integrates their shadow is one less person projecting darkness onto others. Every person who lives authentically is one less person willing to sacrifice their humanity for belonging. Individuation is not apolitical. It's the deepest politics possible, the politics of consciousness itself. Intergenerational trauma, the inheritance of unlived lives. The unlived life doesn't just destroy the person living it. It destroys their children, their grandchildren. It passes down through generations like a genetic disease, except it's not in the DNA, it's in the psyche. Jung called these inherited patterns complexes. Freud called them repetition compulsion. Transgenerational psychology calls them inherited trauma. Whatever the language, the pattern is clear. What you don't consciously integrate, you unconsciously transmit. Margaret's mother lived an unlived life. Trapped by her generation's expectations, she suppressed her own desires, denied her own depths, performed the role of dutiful wife and mother, while something inside her died. She never dealt with this consciously, so she passed it to her daughter. Margaret felt her mother's unlived life as pressure, as expectation, as the unspoken demand that she too should suppress herself for the sake of propriety. Margaret, until 60, complied. Had Margaret not done her individuation work, she would have passed the same pattern to her own daughter, and her daughter to her daughter. The unlived life replicating itself across generations, each woman inheriting the depression and anxiety and quiet desperation of the women before her. But Margaret jumped. She broke the pattern. And in breaking it, she freed not just herself, but potentially all the generations that come after. This is how individuation serves the collective. It breaks cycles. It interrupts the transmission of unconsciousness. It stops the inheritance of unlived lives. When you do your shadow work, you're not just healing yourself. You're healing your lineage. You're preventing the patterns that possessed you from possessing your children. You're becoming the circuit breaker in a system that would otherwise perpetuate suffering indefinitely. The individuated person in the collective, becoming the bridge. Jung believed that individuated people have a specific role in the collective. They become bridges, bridges between conscious and unconscious, between personal and transpersonal, between the rational mind and the deeper wisdom of the psyche, between the individual and the collective. Margaret, in her individuation, became such a bridge, not because she planned it, but because consciousness naturally serves connection. When you know yourself deeply, you can see others deeply. When you've integrated your shadow, you can hold space for others to integrate theirs. When you've faced the abyss, you can guide others through it. This is why genuine elders are so rare and so precious. Not elders in age. Plenty of 80-year-olds are still identified with persona, still unconscious, still running from the soul's demands. But elders in consciousness, people who have undergone the death and rebirth of individuation and emerged as wisdom keepers, these people become essential infrastructure in times of collective crisis. They are the ones who can hold steady when everyone else is panicking. They can see through collective delusions because they've seen through their own. They can speak truth without needing approval because they've already sacrificed approval in service of authenticity. Every healthy society throughout history has recognized the necessity of such elders. Indigenous cultures had specific roles for them: healers, shamans, wisdom keepers, storytellers. They were the people who had walked through fire and returned with medicine. Modern culture has no role for such people. We worship youth, productivity, achievement. We warehouse our elders in nursing homes where their wisdom dies unused. This is suicidal, because we desperately need what individuated elders can offer: perspective, depth, groundedness, the capacity to hold complexity and paradox without being torn apart. Margaret teaching her workshops is not a small thing. Every person she guides toward their own individuation becomes another bridge, another carrier of consciousness, another agent of transformation in a world desperate for transformation. Morphic resonance: how individual transformation spreads. Biologist Rupert Sheldrake proposed a radical idea: morphic resonance. The theory suggests that when a certain number of individuals learn a new behavior or undergo a new development, it becomes easier for all subsequent individuals to learn that same behavior or undergo that same development. The field itself shifts. The pattern becomes available. This is observed empirically. When rats in London learn to navigate a new maze, rats in Australia learn it faster. When blue tits in Britain learn to open milk bottles, blue tits across Europe suddenly develop the same skill. As if knowledge doesn't just spread through direct transmission, but through some deeper field effect. Jung believed something similar about psychological transformation. He called it the collective unconscious. When archetypal patterns are activated and integrated in individual psyches, they become more accessible to all psyches. This means Margaret's individuation makes your individuation easier. Every person who successfully navigates the 60-year crisis strengthens the field for everyone else attempting the same journey. Every person who integrates their shadow makes shadow work fractionally easier for everyone. Every person who answers the soul's call makes the call slightly louder for others. This is not wishful thinking. It's how consciousness evolves, slowly, incrementally, person by person, until a critical mass is reached and the entire field shifts. Jung believed we were approaching such a shift. He saw the modern epidemic of neurosis, depression, meaninglessness as signs that the old structures, the old personas, the old collective identities were collapsing. And in that collapse, the opportunity for mass awakening. But the awakening only happens if individuals do the work, if they undergo their own transformations, if they answer their own calls. You cannot shift the collective field by talking about consciousness, only by embodying it, only by doing the terrifying work of becoming real. Why a critical mass of conscious elders could transform civilization. Imagine if 10% of people over 60 underwent genuine individuation, not the faux enlightenment of spiritual bypassing, not the self-help version that keeps the ego intact while adding a veneer of consciousness, but the real thing. The Jungian descent into darkness, the confrontation with shadow, the death of persona, the integration of the unlived life, the emergence of the authentic self. What would happen? You would have millions of people who are psychologically literate, shadow-aware, no longer identified with collective delusions, capable of holding complexity and paradox, grounded in something deeper than ideology or tribe. These people would be immune to demagoguery. They couldn't be manipulated by fear-mongering or propaganda because they've already faced their deepest fears. They couldn't be seduced by simplistic solutions because they know reality is complex. They would bring wisdom into politics, business, education, healthcare, religion, every domain of collective life currently dominated by unconscious, persona-driven people operating from unexamined wounds and projections. They would mentor younger generations, not with platitudes but with lived truth. They would teach by example that consciousness is possible, that transformation is real, that the soul's demands can be met. Most importantly, they would weaken the collective shadow. Every individuated person reduces the pool of unconscious energy available for possession by collective forces. Every integrated shadow makes collective shadow projection fractionally harder. This is not utopian fantasy. It's how real change happens, not through political revolutions or technological fixes, but through the slow, unglamorous work of individuals becoming conscious, one by one, until the culture itself transforms. Jung believed this was urgent. He spent his final decades warning that humanity faced a choice: mass individuation or mass destruction. Either we wake up collectively, or the accumulated shadow destroys us. 60 years after his death, the choice is even more urgent. The collective crises have intensified. The environmental collapse accelerates. The political extremism deepens. The mental health epidemic worsens. But the opportunity remains. Every person reading this, every person feeling the call, every person standing at the threshold of their own 60-year crisis, you are part of the critical mass that could shift everything. The urgency. We are running out of time. Let's be clear about something. The next 20 years will determine whether human civilization collapses or transforms. This is not alarmism. This is the consensus of climate scientists, sociologists, psychologists, and systems theorists across disciplines. We are approaching multiple tipping points simultaneously: environmental, economic, political, psychological. The window for avoiding catastrophic climate change is closing. The window for preventing democratic collapse is narrowing. The window for addressing epidemic mental illness is limited. And underlying all these crises is the same root cause: collective unconsciousness, a civilization possessed by its own shadow, acting out destructive patterns it won't consciously acknowledge. The only thing that can prevent collapse is a rapid acceleration of individual and collective awakening. Millions of people doing the work Margaret did. Millions of people answering the soul's call, integrating their shadows, becoming conscious. The 60-year crisis is a critical leverage point. People at 60 have accumulated enough life experience to have real wisdom. They're old enough to have seen patterns repeat. They're, hopefully, mature enough to take responsibility. But they're still young enough to have 20 or 30 years of active contribution ahead. If this generation of elders wakes up, if even a fraction of them undergo genuine individuation, they could mentor the next generation, hold space for collective transformation, model what consciousness looks like. If they don't, If they continue to medicate, distract, deny, suppress, they will remain possessed. And possessed people cannot navigate collapse. They panic, they scapegoat, they cling to authoritarians, they accelerate the very destruction they fear. This is why your individuation work is not selfish, it's essential. The world literally depends on people like you having the courage to face their own darkness, to answer their own calls, to become conscious. The hope. It only takes a percentage to shift the field. But here's the hope. You don't need everyone. Systems theory shows that 10 to 15% of a population can shift the entire system if they're coherent, committed, and connected. Social movements succeed when they reach 3.5% active participation. Morphic resonance suggests that transformations accelerate dramatically once a critical threshold is crossed. This means you don't have to convert the masses. You don't have to wait for everyone to wake up. You just have to be part of the critical percentage that shifts the field, and you have to connect with the others doing the same work. Individuated people aren't isolated hermits. They form networks, communities, webs of mutual support and shared consciousness. These networks amplify each other's effects. Margaret found her coven, the women who had also undergone transformation. Together they created a field stronger than any of them could create alone. They held space for each other's shadows. They celebrated each other's breakthroughs. They multiplied each other's impact. This is the model. Individual transformation leading to conscious community, leading to collective shift. You do your work. You find others doing theirs. Together you become a field of consciousness strong enough to influence the larger culture. It's happening already. In pockets and networks across the world, people are waking up, doing shadow work, undergoing individuation, finding each other, creating new forms of culture, new ways of relating, new models of consciousness. It's not yet a mass movement, but it's growing. And if enough people reading this join, if enough people answer the call, do the work, become the bridges, it could reach critical mass within our lifetimes. This is what Jung meant when he said the world hangs by a thread, and that thread is the psyche of man. He meant that individual consciousness matters infinitely, that your choice to face your shadow or avoid it is not a private matter. It affects the whole, your place in the collective transformation. So where do you fit in this larger story? If you're feeling the call, the restlessness, the depression, the sense that your life isn't truly yours, you're not broken, you're being recruited. The collective unconscious is calling you to consciousness. The larger pattern of evolution is moving through you. Your 60-year crisis is not just your crisis. It's the collective crisis manifesting in your individual psyche. And your response to it, whether you answer the call or suppress it, will affect the whole. If you suppress it, you add your energy to the collective shadow. You strengthen the unconscious forces that are destroying the world. You pass your unlived life to the next generation. You remain available for possession by collective delusions. If you answer it, if you do what Margaret did, if you jump into the abyss, you become part of the solution. You integrate shadow that would otherwise be projected. You break cycles that would otherwise continue. You become a bridge, a guide, a carrier of consciousness in a world desperate for consciousness. This is not grandiose, it's simple mechanics, psychological and spiritual physics. What you integrate cannot be projected. What you bring to consciousness cannot possess you. What you embody becomes available to others. Your individuation work is the most important work you will ever do, not because it makes you special, but because it makes you real. And the world doesn't need more special people. It needs more real people, people who know themselves, who can hold their own darkness without projecting it, who can speak truth without needing approval, who can hold steady in chaos because they've already been through chaos internally, who can love without possession because they've found wholeness within themselves. These people are the immune system of civilization. They're the ones who resist collective infection. They're the seed that remains viable when everything else collapses. Be that seed. Do your work. Find your people. Become the bridge. The collective transformation begins with you. This is your moment, not metaphorically, not in some vague spiritual sense. Literally, this moment right now, reading these words, feeling whatever you're feeling, this is the threshold. You know what I'm talking about. You felt it in your body as you read Margaret's story. Recognition. That wordless knowing that her journey is somehow also your journey. That the crisis she faced is the crisis you're facing, or about to face, or desperately trying not to face. The 60-year threshold, or whatever age your particular soul has chosen for its uprising, is not arbitrary. It's not a pathology. It's not a midlife crisis that can be solved with a sports car, or a younger partner, or a new career. It's an initiation. The spirit, your deeper self, your soul, the self with a capital S that Jung described as the totality of the psyche, has been patient. It watched you build your persona at 20, perfect it at 30, succeed with it at 40, master it at 50. It waited while you checked all the boxes, met all the expectations, performed all the roles. But at 60, the waiting ends. The spirit issues an ultimatum. Become real, or I will tear apart everything you've built until you have no choice but to face me. You can hear this ultimatum as a threat, or you can hear it as the greatest gift you will ever receive. Acknowledging the fear, you're not failing, you're awakening. I need you to understand something. The fear you feel is not evidence that you're doing something wrong. The terror of letting go of who you've been, the panic about what happens if you stop performing the role, the dread about disappointing people, losing relationships, destroying your life for something you can barely articulate. This fear is not pathology. It's not weakness. It's not a sign that you should medicate yourself back into compliance. It's rational. You are standing at the edge of an abyss. You are being asked to die, not physically, but psychologically, to let go of the identity you've spent a lifetime constructing, to release the security of the known for the terror of the unknown, to sacrifice the approval of everyone who loves the persona for the authenticity of a self most people won't understand. Of course you're afraid. Anyone with sense would be afraid. But here's what fear does. It clarifies. It shows you what matters. If you weren't afraid, it would mean the stakes were low. The fact that you're terrified means you're standing at the edge of real transformation. Jung wrote, "The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. This means you can choose the conscious descent, or fate will choose it for you. You can jump into the abyss, or the abyss will open beneath you. You can answer the call, or the call will answer itself through crisis, divorce, illness, depression, collapse. The fear is your psyche asking, will you choose this consciously, or must I force it unconsciously? Choose consciously. The journey is hard either way, but at least if you choose it, you're steering." Reframing the crisis, from pathology to initiation. Everything you've been taught about the 60-year crisis is wrong. Culture tells you it's a problem to be solved. Psychiatry tells you it's a disorder to be treated. Self-help tells you it's a phase to be managed. Jung tells you it's an initiation to be undergone. Initiations have been part of human culture for tens of thousands of years. They mark transitions from childhood to adulthood, from ignorance to wisdom, from ego to self. They always involve ordeal, darkness, descent, death, and rebirth. Traditional initiations were held in controlled containers with experienced elders guiding the process. Vision quests, walkabouts, mystery schools, shamanic journeys. Modern culture has abolished formal initiations, but the psyche hasn't. The need for transformation doesn't disappear just because culture doesn't acknowledge it. It just goes underground. And then it erupts spontaneously, often at midlife, always terrifyingly. Your 60-year crisis is a spontaneous initiation. Your psyche is initiating you whether you consent or not. The question is only whether you'll participate consciously. If you participate consciously, if you recognize this as sacred, necessary, transformational, you can work with it. You can use the practices Jung developed: active imagination, shadow work, dream analysis, amplification. You can find guides, therapists, communities who understand what you're going through. If you resist, if you pathologize it, medicate it, deny it, it will initiate you anyway, but through destruction rather than transformation, through breakdown rather than breakthrough. The crisis is the same. The outcome depends on your relationship to it. Reframe it now. I am not having a breakdown. I am undergoing an initiation. I am not failing. I am transforming. I am not losing my mind. I am finding my soul. The Spirit's gift, the opportunity to become real. Let me tell you what the Spirit is offering you. Not comfort, not security, not the maintenance of your current life. The Spirit is offering you something infinitely more valuable. The opportunity to become real. To know yourself. Actually know yourself. Not the edited version you present to the world, but the full catastrophe, the light and the shadow, the beauty and the ugliness. To live from your center, actually your center, not from conditioning or expectation or fear, but from the authentic ground of your being. To create from your depths, actually your depths, not from what sells or succeeds or impresses, but from the source of genuine creativity that exists in every human soul. To love without possession, actually love, not the need-based, projection-laden counterfeit that passes for love, but the seeing and honoring of another's full humanity. To face death with dignity, actually face it, not with denial or terror or clinging, but with the groundedness that comes from having lived authentically. This is what the Spirit offers. This is the gift wrapped inside the crisis. Your persona cannot give you this. Your perfect life, your successful career, your respected position, none of it touches the depths the Spirit is calling you toward. Only the descent does. Only the dark journey. Only the conscious encounter with everything you've avoided and denied and repressed. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." But he also wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The Spirit is offering you that privilege. At 60 or 50 or 70, whatever threshold you're standing at, the Spirit is saying, I will give you a second chance. I will crack open your perfect life so that your real life can emerge. But you have to cooperate. You have to jump. The urgency. The 60-year threshold is a grace period, not a guarantee. Here's something no one wants to hear: the call doesn't wait forever. The 60-year threshold is not arbitrary, but it's also not guaranteed. Some people get the call at 45, some at 70, some never get it at all. They die still identified with their personas, still unconscious, still running. And some people get the call and refuse it. They suppress it, medicate it, distract themselves back into unconsciousness. And sometimes the call doesn't come again. Sometimes the Spirit gives up. Sometimes people live another 20 or 30 years in comfortable deadness, never quite alive, never quite real, just existing. Jung saw this often in his practice. Patients who had been offered the opportunity for transformation, but chose comfort instead. They didn't necessarily suffer dramatic consequences. They just diminished, slowly, quietly, until they died without ever having truly lived. This is the real tragedy, not dramatic collapse, but quiet failure to become. You are being offered a gift right now. The crisis, the restlessness, the depression, the despair, it's a gift. It's the spirit breaking through, demanding recognition. But gifts can be refused. Calls can be ignored. And if you refuse this one, you might not get another. This creates urgency, but not panic. You don't have to do everything today. You don't have to solve the whole crisis this week. But you do have to begin. You have to acknowledge the call. You have to take the first step. Because every day you spend in negotiation, trying to keep the persona intact while also addressing the soul's demands, is a day you're not actually transforming. And the spirit is not interested in negotiation. It's interested in surrender. One concrete first step, what you can do today. So what's the first step? Not start therapy, though you should. Not quit your job. Don't do that yet. Not leave your marriage. Hold on. The first step is simpler and harder. Tell the truth to one person who can hold it, one person you trust, one person who won't try to fix you or talk you out of it or pathologize what you're experiencing. Call them, email them, meet them for coffee and say, I need to tell you something I've been afraid to say. I'm in crisis, not the kind that needs emergency intervention, but the kind that needs witness. My life looks fine from the outside, but inside I'm falling apart. And I think I'm supposed to fall apart. I think something in me is trying to be born, and it can't be born until the old me dies. I don't know what happens next. But I needed to say this out loud to someone who will hear me without trying to fix me. That's it. That's the first step. Because the Spirit's call must be spoken. It must move from the privacy of your own terror into the relational space where transformation actually happens. You cannot individuate in isolation. You need witness. You need container. You need at least one other person who can see you in your unraveling and not panic. If you don't have that person yet, find them. A therapist trained in depth psychology, a spiritual director who understands Jung, a friend who has been through their own dark night, an online community of people doing this work. But find someone. Speak the truth. Make it real by making it relational. That's day one. Affirmation. You have everything you need for this work. Listen carefully. You already have everything you need for this journey. Not everything you think you need. You probably don't have financial security, perfect health, unlimited time, ideal circumstances. You probably have obligations, limitations, complications. But you have what you actually need. A psyche that knows how to transform. A self that wants to be born. An unconscious that will guide you if you learn to listen. Dreams that will show the way. Synchronicities that will appear when you need them. An instinctual wisdom that has been doing this work for millennia. The individuation process is not something you do. It's something that happens through you when you stop resisting. Your job is not to figure it all out. Your job is to cooperate, to show up, to remain conscious through the descent, to keep choosing truth over comfort, to trust the process even when it makes no sense. Jung wrote, "The unconscious is not a demoniacal monster, but a natural entity which, as far as moral sense, aesthetic taste, and intellectual judgment go, is completely neutral. It only becomes dangerous when our conscious attitude to it is hopelessly wrong. Your unconscious is not trying to destroy you. It's trying to complete you. The shadow is not your enemy. It's the part of yourself that got locked away and is now demanding integration. You have everything you need because you are everything you need. The wholeness you're seeking is not outside you. It's buried inside you, waiting for you to excavate it. All the tools you need, active imagination, shadow work, dream analysis, creative expression, embodiment practices are accessible. All the guides you need, therapists, books, teachers, communities, are available. All the courage you need is already present, hidden beneath the fear. You just have to begin. The call to become a guide, mentoring others through crisis. And here's what happens when you do the work. You become capable of guiding others, not because you're enlightened, not because you're perfect, but because you've walked the path. You know what the abyss feels like. You know what the shadow looks like. You know what it takes to die and be reborn. This knowledge makes you invaluable. The world is full of people in crisis, full of people at their own thresholds, feeling their own terror, hearing their own calls. They need guides, not gurus who claim to have all the answers, but fellow travelers who have been through fire and can say, yes, it's terrifying. Yes, you can survive it. Yes, there's something on the other side worth the journey. Margaret became this kind of guide, not immediately. She had to do her own work first, thoroughly, completely, but eventually, naturally, people started coming to her. They recognized something in her, authenticity, groundedness, the scent of real transformation, and she could help them because she had helped herself. This is what individuated people do. They become elders, mentors, guides, not as a career necessarily, though it can be, but as a way of being, as a natural consequence of having undergone the work. Your transformation is not just for you, it's for everyone who will come after you. Everyone in your family who will be freed from inherited patterns. Everyone in your community who will be influenced by your consciousness. Everyone in the collective field who will benefit from one more person having integrated their shadow. You are not doing this work in isolation. You're doing it as part of a larger movement. Thousands of people across the world who are answering the call, doing the descent, becoming conscious. And when enough people do this, the field shifts. The culture transforms. The collective awakens. Your individuation is a thread in that larger tapestry. Don't underestimate its importance.